last week, we have covered all the important concepts. We have understood different types of disasters. Now we are left with the last part of the discussion. We shall complete man made disasters by talking about CBRN disasters. We'll talk about how to deal with man made disasters as well. And then we'll be starting with the last module, under which we will study the global framework with regard to disaster management. We shall also study the disaster management architecture in India and the institutions and funds we have created for disaster management. So, this would be the last part of our discussion. And let's begin by talking about CBRN disasters. I had mentioned about this in the first class itself. So, let's take a look at this again and then talk about disaster management for man made disasters. CBRN disasters stands for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear disasters. So, in short, we call it CBRN. And usually, these disasters are an outcome of either warfare or terrorism. When two states are fighting a war, and if chemical weapons or if bio weapons are used, that falls under the category of a CBRN disaster. If radiological or nuclear devices are used in warfare or even as part of terrorism, such incidents are separately categorized as CBRN disasters. The reason why they are treated separately is because they are very different from your industrial disasters. As we studied yesterday, industrial disasters happen because of negligence or accidents or poor maintenance or sabotage. But CBRN involves an element of national security. In case of CBRN incidents, there is a clear national security element that is involved. There could be a hostile enemy country using CBRN weapons against another country. There could be terrorist organizations which might have procured CBRN weapons and they might be trying to cause these attacks, which cause large scale damage. In fact, the usage of such weapons is seen as prohibited because of the large scale human suffering that they cause. If chemical biological weapons are used, it is considered as a war crime under international law because we have international conventions that prohibit the use of chemical weapons and biological weapons. We have the Chemical Weapons Convention and Biological Weapons Convention that have prohibited the production, the storage, the stockpiling, and usage of these hazardous weapons that cause extensive damage to human life. They are seen as extremely inhuman, and as a result, most countries have abided by the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention and they have eliminated their stockpile of chemical and biological weapons. But still, we hear about few countries and in few conflicts, we have heard reports of chemical bioweapons being used even today. When it comes to nuclear and radiological disasters, the usage of nuclear weapons or a radioactive device or even a large scale nuclear accident in a nuclear facility falls under this category. Even a large accident in a nuclear civilian facility, which is meant for electricity generation, even such disasters are placed under the same category. Because to deal with these disasters, you need specialized training, equipment, and gear as well. Regular disaster response forces won't be able to tackle CBRN hazards as it involves an element of national security. And since the place of disaster would be completely contaminated, you need special clothing, special gear for the forces which will operate in a CBRN environment. So, in the armed forces as well, there will be dedicated CBRN teams that specialize in providing disaster relief in a CBRN environment. For example, within the Indian Army and even in the Indian Navy, you have CBRN teams that are specially trained, specially equipped to deal with such a battle zone where possibly CBRN weapons might have been used. Even the NDRF has specialized in dealing with CBRN disasters. There are 12 battalions in the NDRF, and some of the select battalions have received specialized training in CBRN, and they even have special gear and equipment to deal with such hazards. Is that clear? Now, in the past, there are plenty of examples where either chemical or biological or sometimes nuclear weapons have been used. With regard to nuclear weapons, they've been used only once in warfare, which is during the Second World War, when the US dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm sure all of you would have heard about the kind of extensive damage that Japan suffered from. And especially now, since the movie Oppenheimer has released, I'm sure many of you would have heard about Oppenheimer's moral dilemma as well in developing nuclear weapons which caused such extensive damage. After that, we haven't seen any instance of nuclear weapons being used, but there have been nuclear accidents. There have been radiological incidents that has caused radioactive leakage, and dealing with such disasters becomes a top national security priority. So the major nuclear incidents that we have seen, the major nuclear incidents includes the 3 Mile Island incident in the United States. In the 1980s, there was one nuclear accident at a nuclear facility in the US at a place called 3 Mile Island. So it's called the 3 Mile Island incident in the United States. This was one major nuclear tragedy that occurred. But the biggest of all nuclear tragedies has to be Chernobyl, which was in Soviet Union, and today it's in Ukraine. Chernobyl suffered a massive nuclear tragedy, and even today around the accident site, you still have active radiation. It's a completely contaminated zone, and radioactive leakage has entered the soil, the water, and it even caused extensive radiation spread across Europe as the currents and winds carried the radioactive material far away into Western Europe as well. So Chernobyl has to be the biggest nuclear civilian disaster which has happened. Then we had the Fukushima disaster in 2011 in Japan, which we have already covered. This was the latest nuclear accident that we witnessed. In India, we have seen few minor radiological incidents. Fortunately, we have never experienced any major nuclear accident as such, because our nuclear program has been very well designed with focus on safety and security. So we have never seen any major nuclear accident, but there have been few radiological incidents at Kaiga atomic plant. Then in Delhi, there was an incident few years ago where a medical device containing radioactive cobalt had been disposed in a market, and the scrap dealers who are handling this device, they broke it open, thus exposing themselves, and it led to a death as well in Delhi. This was the biggest radioactive scare that India had seen. Apart from this, we haven't seen any major incidents as such. There was one case of radioactive exposure at Kaiga atomic plant where few workers were affected. Apart from that, we had this incident in Delhi where you have a very popular scrapyard market where a disposed medical device that contained radioactive cobalt was carelessly opened by the scrap dealers. Again, it was not their fault. The fault was with the hospital, which had carelessly disposed a radioactive device without following the standard protocols. So the scrap dealers who found this to be a very curious object, they broke it open, hoping to find some precious metal or scrap, and essentially they exposed themselves, causing severe radioactive burns, and one person got killed as well, along with few injuries. So this was one incident we had recently where we witnessed a radioactive incident. But other than that, like I said, India has been quite fortunate. We haven't seen any major nuclear accident as such. So as far as nuclear safety is concerned, nuclear safety and nuclear security, you have an international agency called the IAEA, which is responsible for promoting nuclear safety and security. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which is headquartered at Vienna in Austria. So this is the global nuclear watchdog, which reports to UN General Assembly and UN Security Council. It's actually an autonomous body. It's not directly a part of the UN, but it submits reports to the General Assembly and the Security Council regarding any nuclear safety, nuclear security incidents. So IAEA plays a very, very important role in promoting nuclear safety around the world. Even during the recent Ukraine war, at the Zaporozhye power plant, there was a very big scare of the war causing a nuclear accident. Even now the threat is there because Russian forces are involved in clashes with Ukrainian forces, and very close to the nuclear plant, clashes are taking place. According to reports, forces were sometimes deliberately targeting the nuclear plant as well. So this caused a very big scare of a possible nuclear disaster, and IAEA inspectors were also deployed at Zaporozhye. Even now, there is a team of IAEA inspectors ensuring the safety security of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So that is another latest scare that we have witnessed since the Russia-Ukraine war began. All right. Then with regard to chemical incidents, major chemical accidents and incidents, we had the Vietnam War, where the US had blatantly used a very dangerous chemical agent called nerve gas, or the sarin gas, which is also referred to as Agent Orange. It's a deadly chemical agent. It's a neurotoxin, and usage of sarin gas today is prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention. But during Vietnam War, back in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have any such convention, and the US had blatantly used Agent Orange against Vietnamese forces. This had caused widespread destruction, inhuman destruction in Vietnam. Recently, there were reports of usage of chemical weapons by Syria and also by Russia. In the Syrian civil war, President Bashar al-Assad was accused of using chemical weapons against the rebel groups. Even Russia has been accused of using chemical weapons in the Ukrainian conflict. But again, the usage of weapons by Russia is largely unconfirmed. But Syria definitely had used chemical weapons, which was confirmed by the OPCW, the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which enforces the Chemical Weapons Convention. Just like IAEA promotes nuclear safety and security, to enforce Chemical Weapons Convention, we have a global body called OPCW, Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So OPCW inspectors confirmed the usage of chemical weapons in Syria during the Syrian civil war. So these are some recent incidents. Then if you look at biological incidents, usage of, let's say, bioweapons, plague had been weaponized during the World War. Several European powers, including Nazi Germany, Britain, they had weaponized plague, and apparently it had been used as bioweapons. But weaponization of plague was quite common during the World War period. Then we have seen the usage of anthrax by terrorist outfits, including Al-Qaeda, particularly after the 9/11 attacks. In the US, a number of mails and parcels were received, which would contain anthrax. Anthrax is a bacterial spore. It's like a powder, which would be placed inside mails and parcels and delivered to certain addresses. So when people opened the box, they would expose themselves to anthrax, which is a bioagent, a bioweapon. So we have seen such incidents in the US, but we haven't seen any major case of bio warfare. All right, but definitely many countries had developed bioweapons, including plague, then the family of coronavirus, then anthrax and other bioagents have been weaponized. At one point, all major powers, including India, possessed some kind of bioweapons or the other. But today, under Biological Weapons Convention, all countries have completely destroyed their stockpile and they're no longer producing or storing bioweapons. So this is something that you should be aware of, at least the basics. Even though we haven't seen major incidents happening, you should have that awareness that CBRN hazards are more dangerous as it is deliberately used as part of warfare or terrorism. So it requires a special handling as there is a national security element involved. Defense Ministry, armed forces, intelligence agencies, even they will be involved in management of these disasters along with your CBRN response forces. So that's why we have to pay special attention to CBRN hazards. Now the last point, the biggest industrial disaster that India has witnessed. In fact, it's considered as one of the biggest industrial disasters in the world itself. I'm referring to the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. It was a very devastating incident. Even today, the victims are still paying the price. The impact of Bhopal gas tragedy is felt even today by the victims and their families. In Bhopal, a factory called Union Carbide, which was owned by a US multinational corporation, it saw a toxic leakage of methyl isocyanate. Methyl isocyanate is highly toxic. This toxic gas, this toxic chemical leaked out in Bhopal in 1984, causing massive deaths and permanent damage to several victims. Thousands were killed in this tragedy. In the residential areas around Union Carbide's factory, thousands and thousands of deaths were reported within few hours as people inhaled the toxic methyl isocyanate, and it brings about a very brutal death. Those who survived, they continued with the injuries, the impact, and there have been cases where it has been passed on to next generations as well. So it has had a huge impact on the victims. And the worst part is that the victims were never adequately compensated. So this is where the debate of liability comes into question. When such accidents happen, who is liable? Who should pay compensation to the victims? Should it be the industry or the government? And what should be the liability of both the entities? This has to be clearly defined. Is that clear? Now, obviously, if you make the industry entirely liable, it may not encourage companies to come and invest in India. At the same time, industries cannot be let off for their negligence, for their failure to ensure safety. So there should be a credible liability law in place where the liability of the industry is defined. And beyond that, the government can also take up some liability. Victims of Bhopal gas tragedy are still fighting cases against Union Carbide seeking compensation. They're fighting cases against the government because they never received adequate compensation for the losses that they suffered. So the Bhopal gas tragedy was indeed a learning lesson for India, and it pushed India to introduce the Environment Protection Act in 1986 that introduced the polluter pays principle. The Environment Protection Act of 1986, it has introduced the polluter pays principle, which means the polluter, right, for any damage to the environment and even to the people, will be held liable for the damages that have been caused. In the case of nuclear related incidents, we have a nuclear liability law. In order to encourage foreign nuclear companies to invest in India and set up nuclear reactors in India, we have brought out a nuclear liability law that defines the liability of the manufacturers and the government. Foreign companies, of course, are not happy with the liability law. That's why US and French nuclear companies are yet to start their nuclear projects in the country. But the Indian Parliament, which enacted the law, believes that we should learn lessons from the Bhopal gas tragedy. And that's why very strict liability provisions have been placed under the nuclear liability law. The burden is more on the manufacturers. If there are nuclear accidents in their reactors, they will be held liable. The operator of the plant will also be held liable to pay compensation to the victims. So, US and other countries are putting pressure on India to amend the nuclear liability law. But India is very clear that this is the will of the parliament. The parliament, after a lot of deliberation under the then Manmohan Singh government, brought out this law following lessons from Bhopal gas tragedy to ensure that the victims will receive adequate compensation from the operator of the plant and also from the manufacturers. Is that clear? So just pay attention to these basic points. It's more than enough. You don't have to go in depth. These basic points, the laws that I have mentioned for industrial regulations, these legislations, just the names, how they help in controlling and regulating the industry, how it helps in enforcing safety standards and protocols. That basic awareness is more than enough with regard to industrial accidents and man-made disasters. Now, coming to the last part of my discussion here, please note down this prelims point. Please make a note of this. It's relevant for your prelims. If there are any nuclear radiological incidents in the world, to determine the magnitude of the event, there is a scale which has been designed called INES, the International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale. It's a scale that has been developed by IAEA and the Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD is a major economic platform of the European countries, West European countries. So along with IAEA, they have developed this event scale that helps in determining the extent of the nuclear accident, the magnitude of a nuclear accident by rating it on a scale. Just like we have the Richter scale to signify the impact of earthquakes, to determine the magnitude of earthquakes. Similarly, to give a scale and a rating for nuclear events and radiological events, the INES scale was developed in 1990. This followed major nuclear disasters like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island incident. It was after that the IAEA developed this scale along with the Nuclear Energy Agency of OECD. So today, any nuclear accident or radiological incident in the world will be ranked or scaled on the INES. The magnitude will be determined as per the INES scale. So man-made disasters, of course, they leave behind a lot of devastation and destruction. As you can expect, there will be loss of human lives and injuries. There will be a lot of human suffering. There will be damage to the environment and biodiversity. There could be damage to infrastructure, and economic losses and social impact will also be felt because of such man-made disasters. Especially industry workers, they are highly vulnerable to the impact of such tragedies, right? So it's a question of labor welfare as well. So through your labor laws, you need to provide enough social security to industry workers. To the labor laws, you have to provide insurance. You have to build a solid social security scheme that protects industry workers in case of such accidents and tragedies. Is that clear? Because these accidents will primarily affect the factory workers and the neighborhood around it. So you have to consider the impact of these incidents, and liability laws and compensation laws have to be in place. Is that clear? Now, how do we deal with these incidents? How do we manage man-made disasters which keep occurring every now and then? Right? There are many boiler explosions which happen. There have been toxic leakage of gases, chemicals, and hazardous substances which has caused disasters in India. We have seen incidents where we have witnessed fires in factories and commercial buildings, right? So all these are man-made tragedies. So the approach is exactly the same. Just like you deal with natural disasters, you have to approach this with a holistic perspective. You have to focus on implementing the disaster management cycle and come up with measures under 3 stages of disaster management: pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster. So if you can design effective scientific measures under the 3 stages of disaster management cycle and implement them effectively, you will be able to prevent some of the man-made disasters and definitely mitigate the impact as well. Many of these tragedies are preventable if industries are strictly following the safety protocols and SOPs, if they are conducting regular servicing of equipment, if they are maintaining the machinery, if they are replacing the spare parts regularly. Definitely you can prevent these tragedies from occurring. With regard to fire hazard, right? Urban fire has become very common. There have been many incidents where theaters, malls, and shopping complexes have caught fire, killing many people in the country. These are completely avoidable tragedies if the fire safety norms are followed during construction. Fire exits have to be clearly built and marked. There should be availability of fire extinguishers. The personnel who are managing the building, the security guards and the operational teams, they should be trained on how to deal with fire incidents. Right? Mock drills will be necessary, training will be necessary. So enforcing the fire code or the fire standards is again the responsibility of the local authorities and the fire department. When buildings are being constructed, right? When licenses are being provided, when approvals are being given, there should be very strict enforcement of the fire standards. Fire safety norms have to be prioritized for all buildings. We have the laws, we have the regulations. Problem is enforcement. The lack of enforcement has been the biggest problem. The same with regard to industrial SOPs. With regard to standard operating procedures in industries, especially in hazardous industries, we have all the regulations needed. We have the Factories Act, we have Explosives Act, the Petrochemicals Act. They provide for enough regulations, but problem is they're not enforced by the concerned authorities and the departments. This is again due to corruption and inefficiency in governance. So tackling corruption in these departments and local bodies is critical. Enforcing these safety norms, these protocols very clearly is important to ensure safety in the industry. So along with some early warning measures, we should think about zoning standards for industrial zones. Zoning standards for industrial zones. When cities are being planned, when urban clusters are being designed, separate zones are allocated for industrial development. But problem is, over a few decades, these laws are broken, violated by the local bodies. They allow rampant expansion of the city, and residential areas will come up around the industrial corridor. If you go back and look at your city master plans, if you look at the old master plans of your cities, you will see that industrial clusters were supposed to be located on the suburbs of the city, on the outskirts of the city. But today our cities have expanded without any planning, and the industrial clusters have been surrounded by residential layouts. So any accident which happens in these factories will immediately affect the civilian population in the residential neighborhood. This is again the fault of local bodies, the state governments, and the politicians and the officials who have not enforced the regulations, because there is a nexus between them and the industry. Is that clear? So tackling corruption at the grassroots is critical, and enforcing zoning standards will really help in containing the damage. If hazardous industries are located at a safe distance, away from cities, away from dense population, even if an accident were to happen, you can still mitigate the damage. I'll give you an example. Recently, in 2020, when the lockdown was lifted, the first lockdown, several factories were not maintained because of the lockdown restrictions. In Vizag, that's in Vishakhapatnam, there was one major tragedy which happened as soon as the lockdown was lifted. It was a industrial plant working for the electronics company LG. There was a leakage of a toxic gas, and many people were injured and some were killed as well because of the leakage of the toxic gas. This incident occurred because the equipment had not been maintained during lockdown. For almost 2 months, no one had maintained the equipment. So when the lockdown was lifted and the plant was started again, there was a malfunction which happened and toxic gases leaked out. But tragedy could have been avoided if there were no residential areas around it. But in this case, right next to these industrial plants, there was a residential neighborhood, densely populated residential neighborhood. The local authorities had allowed such expansion and construction to happen. Even though there are strict regulations for zoning standards and land use planning, they had allowed residential neighborhoods to come up right next to hazardous industries. Right? If the standards were enforced, the tragedy would have never happened. So there are many such examples in India, many incidents which are avoidable entirely, or at least the damage could be minimized. So we have to enforce fail-safe design standards, implement multi-layer safety systems with enough redundancies. What do you mean by redundancy? Even if one safety system fails, there should be a backup. And for a backup, there should be another backup. Having multiple backups ensures a fail-safe design. That's what you mean by redundancies in a system. Let's say in a particular plant, power supply is critical. Power supply should be there 24/7. If power supply fails, the machinery could also fail and it could leak a toxic gas. So in such a plant, there should be multiple backups to ensure that there is constant power supply. Even if the main power supply goes out, there should be a backup generator. And for the generator, there should be another backup. So creating those multiple redundancies and ensuring a foolproof design in the structure of the plant, in the machinery, is extremely important. So again, it's the responsibility of the government, the central government, the state governments. They have to enforce these laws through the concerned departments and local bodies. Spreading awareness amongst people and within the industry will also play a role in building capacity. Then the liability framework, which I was talking about, to determine compensation, to hold the guilty accountable. Even today in India, there are many legal loopholes when it comes to accountability and compensation. So we need to come out with a better liability framework which places accountability on the factory owners, the industries, where they are not just held accountable for paying compensation, but if there is negligence, criminal charges should also be pressed on them. We do have laws, but the problem is they're all outdated. They're all scattered in different legislations. So there should be a single legal framework that deals with liability and criminal prosecution as well. So you can suggest such legal measures to strengthen the legal framework to enforce these standards and regulations. Then please stress on the importance of inspections, especially state departments, few central ministries, and local bodies which have the enforcement powers. they have to take ownership. It is their primary responsibility to conduct periodic inspections as per the regulations and ensure that all safety checks are in place, ensure that SOPs are being followed, ensure that worker safety is being prioritized by giving them protective equipment and gear. So all the concerned government departments and institutions, they have to effectively carry out inspections, and tackling corruption at this level is extremely important. Good governance has to be introduced, corruption has to be tackled, right? That's when we can provide for strict enforcement of the regulations. And finally, you need dedicated response for these disasters. Since industrial disasters and CBRN hazards are of extremely dangerous nature, you need special training, special equipment, and resources to deal with such situations. So this should be made available to the response forces. Is that clear? Now, for example, when COVID-19 broke out, right, it was a biohazard. You saw how the frontline responders started wearing PPE kits, masks, etc. Such protective gear is essential. Similarly, in a CBRN environment where chemical bioweapons have been potentially used, right, protective gear is very, very critical. Filtration masks and protective clothing, then detectors to detect the extent of damage. So such tools, technology has to be brought in, such resources has to be brought in to empower the response forces to respond effectively during such incidents. Modern firefighting techniques, techniques to contain the spread of harmful chemicals or biohazard agents, right? All that has to be incorporated into the disaster response plan. So by doing that, you can prevent some of the disasters and you can at least mitigate the impact of disasters. So paying attention to man-made disasters is as important as paying attention to natural disasters. Especially in countries like India, in developing countries, chances of industrial accidents are more. It's mainly due to poor maintenance, negligence, and lack of servicing and lack of safety standards. So that's why the government has to take the lead, create the legal framework, create early warning systems where possible, strengthen the response mechanisms, and ensure that the industry follows the safety standards and norms. If this is done, then definitely you can prevent some disasters and you can minimize the impact as well. All right. So this completes my discussion on man-made disasters. So going forward, please read newspapers regularly. If you come across any industrial accident, right, or any major industrial tragedy which has happened in India or around the world, please make a note of it, because you can use that as examples when you're writing this answer. You can get a broad question on man-made disasters, on industrial accidents and disasters. When you're explaining these points, it's always good to add some examples. As I gave you some examples like Bhopal gas tragedy, the gas leak in Vishakhapatnam, boiler blasts in NTPC power plants, the recent fire in a tutorial center in Delhi, right? The major nuclear incidents. Just the name, just the example will be helpful to substantiate your argument. So please make a note of such major industrial accidents which are going to happen in the future and use that directly in your answers. All right. Now, if you guys have any questions, any doubts on hazards and disasters, please let me know. I can spend few minutes on your doubts. And after that, I'll be starting the last module. We'll be talking about UN and disaster management and the disaster management framework in India. And we'll also look at some previous questions. So before we head towards the last module, let's spend few minutes on your questions and doubts. Lyran Lapakam is asking, please repeat adoption of fail-safe design. See, even when the industrial plants are being built, when factories are being set up, when machinery is being installed, safety protocols have to be followed. In the design of the plant, fail-proof or fail-safe design has to be incorporated. Now, let's say in a factory, boilers and furnaces are being used. So when connecting the pipes, when designing the boiler itself, when installing it. Fail-safe designs have to be used to ensure that you don't witness any accidents in the future. All the required safety measures have to be taken. Similarly, plants dealing with dangerous chemicals, toxic chemicals, they have to create multiple backups to prevent any leakage from the plant. Even if there is an accident, it should be contained within the plant. It shouldn't leak out into the environment. So you can incorporate the safety design in the construction of the plant itself. That's what you mean by a fail-safe design or foolproof design. And for safety systems, there should be multiple backups. There should be redundancies in the system. Even if one fail-proof system goes down because of some malfunction, there should be another backup which kicks in. Is that clear? Now imagine there is a toxic chemical plant where the functions, operations are controlled through a computer. Imagine there is a cyber attack on this network and the computer is brought down. And because of that, there might be a chemical leakage. So in such incidents, there should be a backup. There should be a redundant system, a foolproof system, where even if some control systems are down, there should be backup systems which take over the operations and ensure the safe functioning of the toxic chemical plant. So this is what you mean by fail-safe design or foolproof design. Vaishna is asking, what type of disaster is an oil spill? Oil spill is an environmental disaster. It's not exactly a disaster under this category. It's an environmental disaster. It's for environment and ecology. Vijay says, a sanitizer factory caught fire, sir, during COVID-19. Yes, that was also one accident. So any such examples that you have read in newspapers, make a note. And you can use that when you're talking about industrial disasters. You can further give a better explanation based on that. Montu is asking, if liability is solely on government authorities, will it reduce corruption? No, it won't. And also, placing liability entirely on the government is unfair. Then you are not having any motivation for the industry to focus on safety. If they're not liable to pay compensation, industries will not follow safety standards. If they know government is going to be held liable, right? Then factories and industries have no incentive, no motivation to focus on safety. Liability should always be there on the plant operator, the manufacturer, and partly on the government. So liability has to be shared. It has to be divided between the operator of the plant, who's operating, because they'll be responsible for negligence, any accidents. The manufacturer as well. There could be a faulty design which caused the accident, and the government. So well-defined liability law should place the responsibility on the government, the industry, that is the plant operator, and also the manufacturer of the equipment. SOP full form, standard operating procedure or standard operating protocol. Vipul is asking, can we give name of nuclear threat as 6th generation warfare? No. Nuclear warfare falls under unconventional warfare. All right. You can't call it 6th generation warfare. It would be incorrect. Santosh is asking, is there any mechanism to clean seas from polluting by crude oil? Unfortunately, no. Yes, there are few technologies. Through nanotechnology, there are some compounds which have been developed, even through live organisms like certain bacteria. There are certain bacteria and algae which can consume such toxic substances, but it's not widely used or deployed. IAEA full form. Ideally, you shouldn't even be asking the question. Full forms is something you can always Google. I've repeated 2-3 times as well, right? IAEA stands for International Atomic Energy Agency. Devansh is asking, a nuclear winter is an apocalyptic event? Potentially, yes. So Devansh is referring to the aftermath of a nuclear blast. It's believed that if there are mega nuclear explosions carried out, let's say multiple nuclear bombs are used in a conflict, then the resultant nuclear cloud, the mushroom clouds that's going to envelop the earth, right? It can cause a potential nuclear winter. Just like a volcano can release a lot of particulate matter and cover the atmosphere and block sunlight. Similarly, large-scale usage of nuclear weapons in a potential apocalyptic war can cover the entire Earth, blocking sunlight, which could push us into a nuclear winter. Right? So it's a hypothetical situation, which is a likely possibility in case of a full-blown nuclear war between all major powers. Hema is asking, sir, human medical waste polluting rivers is a big crime. What type of action should be taken? See, human medical waste being handled improperly is an environmental hazard, not a disaster again. All right, it's an environmental hazard. So we have biosafety norms in the country on how human medical waste has to be handled. So yes, there are legal provisions to penalize hospitals and diagnostic labs if they don't follow the safety norms, but it's an environmental hazard, not a disaster. Santosh is asking, sir, why our country didn't sign nuclear suppliers group? We want to sign nuclear suppliers group. We want to become a member of NSG, but we are not being allowed because of China. China is blocking our entry into NSG. Shweta is asking, sir, are current affairs webinar topics very important? Of course. That's why we are conducting webinars every week, right? And it helps you revise and cover all the weekly developments. Every Tuesday and Thursday, please attend the webinars. It'll help you to cover current affairs very easily. Ambesh is asking, sir, how early warning systems can be developed in case of man-made disasters as they are spontaneous? See, even in factories and industries, we have many alarms, alerts, and early warning systems available. I'm sure if you are working in a corporate setup in your offices, there will be smoke detectors, fire alarms that are installed. That's an early warning system, right? So in every factory, you can do the same. There are variety of sensors available that can monitor critical functions. If something is going wrong, immediate alerts can go out and people can evacuate. Let's say in a metallurgical plant or in a thermal power plant where boilers and geysers are being used, where there is high temperature, high pressure, if some pipe or valve is failing and if an explosion is about to happen, minutes before that, sensors can pick up the data and set off an alarm in the factory so that the workers will get few minutes to run away and evacuate themselves. So in case of man-made disasters, early warning is actually very easy. It's very much possible. To deal with fires, as I told you, smoke detectors, fire alarms, automatic fire water dispensers. These are basic early warning and protection systems that can be installed in factories, industries, and commercial places. Hema is asking, sir, in Bhopal gas tragedy, it was the biggest man-made disaster which happened in India. Can we express government's negligence in it? Yes, there was government negligence as well, right? Because the safety standards had not been enforced. And after what happened after the disaster, the factory was never held accountable properly. Union Carbide owners were allowed to run away from India and adequate compensation wasn't paid to the victims. So you can point out the failure of the government in the way in which Bhopal gas tragedy was handled. Rashmi is asking reason for current floods in the north. Haven't we discussed this topic? You're asking the question a little too late. Is fire at a petrol bunk a disaster? That would be more of an accident, not a disaster. Okay. So guys, these were some of the questions. Now, let's move on to the last part of disaster management. It's a small module, but still the points are very, very important. The topics I'll be covering will be extremely important for your mains, even for your prelims. All right. First, we'll focus on the global framework for disaster management. It might take around 1 hour or so, or maybe less than that. So let's complete this first. Let's talk about UN and disaster management. What global framework has been put in place to deal with disaster management? And based on that, let's understand how India has created a disaster management architecture. All right. See, at the very beginning of disaster management classes, I told you the approach of the world towards disaster management. I'm sure many of you would remember the discussion. I had told you that before 1990s, disaster management was seen as an ad hoc part of governance. Most governments in the world before 1990s, they did not pay enough attention to disasters. They never implemented a comprehensive, holistic approach for disaster management because these were seen as one-time emergencies. It was seen as a one-off event. Let's say in some country, volcanic eruption happened. In some country, floods happened. In some country, earthquakes happened. In India, there was a cyclone which hit the country. These were seen as one-off incidents, one-off natural tragedies happening here and there. So as a result, governments never paid holistic attention to disaster management. They were only reacting to disasters. There was no planning, no preparedness, no dedicated institutions, no dedicated response forces, no dedicated funds allocated, no early warning systems. Once the disaster happened, then governments would react and provide some basic emergency relief. They would arrange for some basic response through the armed forces, through regular armed forces itself, the army, navy, or air force. They would conduct some search and rescue operations, give some assistance, and provide some emergency relief through medical aid, food, shelter, compensation, etc. So this was a reactive approach of governments towards disasters prior to 1990s. Is that clear? Before 1990s, it was a reactive, ad hoc approach. Now, this underwent a major change post 1990s. This approach witnessed a major change after 1990s thanks to the role of the United Nations. The UN played a very, very important role in pushing a debate on environmental issues, on environmental hazards, and its connection with extreme weather events and disasters. This awareness slowly started coming up through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Slowly, there was greater awareness on the environmental damage that we humans were causing. Until the end of World War II, we never bothered about the environment. We never cared about pollution. Right? Industrial revolution had caused massive pollution in Europe. London especially was suffering from severe smog conditions, and yet very limited action was taken, and we humans in general didn't pay attention to pollution and environmental damage that our activities were causing. The world wars itself caused massive pollution and environmental damage, right? Because of all the explosions, because of the increase in industrial production to produce weapons and other supplies for the war. So there was massive environmental damage throughout 1800s and 1900s. For a good 150 years, we had massively polluted the earth, released a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, which had started affecting our environment and biodiversity. It was only after the World War ended, it was only from 1945 and 1950s onwards that some attention was given to environmental issues through the United Nations. If you look at the UN Charter, which is the constitution of the UN, it asks UN to focus on environmental issues as well, along with promoting global peace and security, along with dealing with disputes, conflicts, promoting socio-economic growth. UN was also mandated to focus on environmental issues and problems. For the first time at the global level, there was some kind of understanding that we should focus on environmental damage that our industrial activities are causing. So this led to a series of conferences from 1960s to 1990s, which brought up a lot of consensus amongst various countries and scientific institutions that our industrial activities, our over exploitation, the pollution we were causing was having a huge detrimental impact on the climate. The science of climate change came out. The damage we had caused to ozone layer was clearly exposed in 1980s, right? How CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, had extensively damaged the ozone layer, particularly in the polar areas, was conclusively proven, which led to the historic Montreal Protocol. For the first time, the world had come together to solve an environmental problem, which was the Montreal Protocol in 1980s, 1986, 87. So what I'm saying is that from 1950s to 1990s, there was greater environmental awareness that was spreading around the world, especially through the UN and its various institutions. More awareness was being promoted regarding environmental damage that human activities, anthropogenic activities, were causing. With regard to the anthropogenic damage, there was a greater recognition, and this was being brought out through scientific evidence, right? We started proving the damage caused by toxic chemicals, fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions. So this conclusively gave us proof regarding how human beings had contributed to the damage to the ozone layer, how we had accelerated global warming, thus triggering permanent climate change, which increases extreme weather events and disasters. So there was a better understanding of the connection between human exploitation of resources, environmental damage, and increasing disasters. This realization is what led to three major. Is that clear? That is what we will be studying. After 1990s, three major UN-led conferences have been held on disaster management, which was a result of the greater awareness that was spreading on environmental protection and the increasing disasters. Is that clear? So let's go through the sequence of developments that led to more focus on disaster management. In 1960s, the UN General Assembly called for measures regarding severe disasters. Is that clear? Since governments were not focusing on disasters, since governments were only reacting and adopting ad hoc approach to disasters, UNGA gave a call for proactive measures to deal with severe disasters. Following this, the UN established a fund to provide assistance to countries which were affected by natural disasters. Is that clear? So the UN established an assistance fund which functioned from 70s to 80s, through which some financial support would be given through the UN to poor countries, low-income countries, and underdeveloped countries if they were affected by major disasters. Following this, the UNDRO, the UN Disaster Reduction Office, was established to manage the fund and help the countries, assist the affected countries. A dedicated UN office was established for this purpose, called UNDRO, the UN Disaster Reduction Office. Then the 1990s was declared as the International Decade for Disaster Reduction, Natural Disaster Reduction. Is that clear? As I told you, by 1980s, there was more awareness on environmental damage. In 1960s, the UN Environment Program had held a major conference on environment. This was the first major conference on environmental issues held in 1960s by the UN Environment Program. In early 1990s, we had the Rio Earth Summit. The Rio Earth Summit marked a major transformation of the approach of the world towards environmental issues, right? Because through Rio Earth Summit, we established the Climate Change Convention, Convention on Biological Diversity, then UN Convention to combat desertification. Three major conventions were brought out through the Rio Earth Summit of 91-92. Before that, we had the Montreal Protocol, which I was mentioning, with regard to protection of our ozone layer to deal with ozone depleting substances like CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. So this global framework that was developing from 60s to 90s on environmental issues is what led the UN to pay more attention to natural disasters. Because by now, the link between global warming environmental damage and extreme weather events and disasters had been clearly established. It had been clearly established with scientific evidence that our industrial activities, our exploitation of resources, the pollution we were causing, right, the global warming we had contributed to, these events were leading to more disasters, more extreme weather events. So this understanding led the UN to declare the 1990s as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. This was a landmark development. For the first time, global focus and attention was being shifted towards disaster management. And in 1993, the UN convened the first major conference, the World Conference on Disaster Reduction. Is that clear? Japan took the leadership role, as Japan was one of the biggest victims of disasters. It decided to host these UN conferences, and the first conference was held at Yokohama. Is that clear? Following this, two more conferences were held at Hyogo and Sendai. These are the three UN-led conferences which Japan has hosted, focused on disaster reduction and disaster management. Got it? So in 1994, the first World Conference on Disaster Reduction through the UN was organized at Yokohama with complete support from Japan. The International Strategy for Disaster Reduction was also launched by the Economic and Social Council, the ECOSOC, which is one of the principal organs of the UN, and the UN Disaster Reduction Office was now named as UNISDR. It was restructured as the UN Institution for International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. The UNISDR was set up. Now, this became the lead UN body to focus on disaster reduction, to implement the global strategy on disaster reduction. So the decade of 1990s was very crucial with regard to disaster management. First, we had Rio Earth Summit focusing on environmental issues like climate change, desertification, conservation of biodiversity. So these three conventions had come out. Parallelly, the decade was declared as International Decade for Disaster Reduction, and the first World Conference at Yokohama was held in 1994, which eventually led to the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. And accordingly, UNISDR was established through the United Nations. So the UN has played a direct role in bringing the countries together to focus on disaster management and to provide for a proactive, holistic approach to disaster management. Now, this is the change that you witness in disaster management. From a reactive and ad hoc approach before, we have changed towards a proactive, holistic approach by adopting the disaster management cycle with focus on disaster risk reduction. Is that clear? So the three UN conferences have contributed to this, starting with the Yokohama conference. So the World Conference on Disaster Reduction is a series of UN-led conferences. Till now, three conferences have been held. All three conferences have been hosted by Japan. All right. First was Yokohama Conference in 1994, the Hyogo Conference in 2005, the Sendai Conference in 2015. These are the three UN conferences, the World Conference on Disaster Reduction. The UNGA has adopted the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and the previous Disaster Reduction Office became UNISDR. It became the UN body to implement the framework adopted through these conferences. After each conference, a framework would be brought out, right? Under Yokohama, under Hyogo, Sendai, few goals and targets were defined and identified. So implementing them, helping other countries to achieve those goals and targets became the task of UNISDR. All right. So essentially, the UN's mandate in disaster management has expanded quite considerably in the last few years. And recently, the second and third conferences also have been held so that the UN plays a bigger role in assisting countries to focus on disaster risk reduction, to become proactive in the field of disaster management. So we will take a brief look at these UN conferences. You should have that basic awareness regarding these three world conferences that have been held on disaster risk reduction. Is that clear? So please understand the background, the role of UN, and how our approach has changed, the global approach has changed from 1990s onwards. All right. So to summarize, prior to 1990s, we never paid much attention to environmental issues and disasters. It was a reactive ad hoc approach around the world. But after Second World War, there was growing awareness regarding environmental damage that we were causing. So throughout 1960s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of UN conferences were held which dealt with environmental issues. All right. We had the Stockholm Conference held by UN Environment Program in 1960s. Then the Montreal Protocol in 1980s. Rio Earth Summit that led to three major conventions in 1990s. We brought out Climate Change Convention, Convention on Biological Diversity, UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So basically, during these 40 years, from 1950s to 1990s, the world changed with regard to its understanding of environmental issues and how it is connected to disasters. So as disasters were increasing due to human intervention, as the impact was growing and as developing countries were facing the bigger impact, the UN pushed for International Decade of Disaster Reduction, and it contributed to the World Conference on Disaster Reduction. So from 94, three world conferences were held, hosted by Japan. The Yokohama Conference gave rise to Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action. Hyogo Conference led to Hyogo Framework for Action that was implemented for 10 more years. And currently, we are implementing the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction during this period. All right. So please remember the timelines as well. It's very important. From 94 to 2004, the world was following the Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action, including India. Then Hyogo Framework was adopted for the next decade. And from 2015 to 2030, along with UN Sustainable Development Goals, as part of Agenda 2030 of the UN, the Sendai Framework was adopted, which focuses on disaster risk reduction. Is that clear? Now, let's take a brief look at each of the frameworks. You don't have to by heart this, you don't have to mug it up. Sendai Framework will be more important, but just take a brief look at what principles, goals were contained under Yokohama Strategy and Hyogo Framework. Understanding that development is more important. You don't have to sit and mug up every point here. It's unlikely for UPSC to ask a question on Yokohama and Hyogo. All right, maybe for prelims, not for mains. So don't sit and mug up the 10 principles and the goals. Just understand how UN contributed to this changing development in disaster management. Sendai Framework is more important. There, of course, you have to remember the goals which have been laid out. All right. So let's look at Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action that introduced 10 principles for a safer world with regard to disasters. The countries which participated in the Yokohama Conference, they agreed on 10 guiding principles. All right. Now, these commitments are not legally binding. Please remember this. It's voluntary. Countries, if they are interested, if they want to improve disaster management, they can voluntarily adopt these standards and principles. UN is not going to force them. It's not a legally binding agreement. Is that clear? All the three frameworks, they're not legally binding. It's a global standard which has been developed through the UN with participation of all the countries. And if countries are interested, they can voluntarily adopt these standards into their national policy. It's left to each individual country. Is that clear? But UN is ready to assist. It will readily assist all the countries in providing technical expertise, in arranging financial support, etc. If such support is needed, UN will help the countries in adopting the standards. To adopt and implement the standards, UN will provide all the help necessary, be it sharing technical expertise, providing funds, etc. UN will assist the countries to adopt them into their national policy and plan if countries have voluntary interest. All right. So these principles, goals, and targets which I'll be discussing, they are not legally binding on any UN member. Understood? So it's a global framework which has been created. Countries can follow that to improve disaster management. So under Yokohama strategy, brought out in 1994, 10 principles were identified that focused on risk assessment, which is nothing but risk analysis that we have studied. Remember, under every disaster, I kept pointing out that in pre-disaster phase, what is the first step? First step is to understand hazard and vulnerability. Create hazard vulnerability maps. Understand the risk through scientific studies and assessment. That's what you mean by risk assessment. Today, if India and other countries are following this process, it's because the principle was outlined under Yokohama strategy. First principle is risk assessment. Understand the risk. What risk is posed by a disaster? Next, disaster prevention preparedness concepts were introduced. Focusing on prevention and preparedness, this was made a priority as part of disaster management to reduce the need for providing emergency relief later during the disaster. Is that clear? Priority was placed on prevention and preparedness, preventing disasters from happening, preparing before a disaster occurs. So you don't have to scramble your emergency relief after the disaster has happened. Next, it highlighted the importance of all the government levels in implementing disaster management processes, be it the national government, the provincial, regional governments, local bodies, and as well as bilateral, multilateral, international mechanisms. The UN said, if we have to prevent disasters, prepare for it, and reduce the impact, national governments have to work closely with provincial governments and local bodies. This is within a country. Within a country, the national government, that's the central government, has to work closely with provincial governments, the state governments, and the local bodies. Similarly, at the global level, there should be bilateral, multilateral, and international efforts through bilateral relations, through multilateral groupings, and through international organizations. There should be collaborative effort to implement these standards to prevent disasters and prepare for disasters. That was the third principle. Next, developing and strengthening capacities to prevent, reduce, mitigate disasters. Essentially, capacity building was highlighted. Because without capacity building, how will you procure the resources? How will you train your response forces? So capacity building was made a top priority. Is that clear? This became the fourth principle. Next, it highlighted the importance of early warnings, how effective early warning systems could be developed, how forecasting can be improved, and how real-time alerts can be given out in order to safeguard the population before disasters can strike. So it urged countries to rely on technology, use telecommunications, satellite technology, and other advanced meteorological tools to forecast disasters before they happen and give out early warnings so that it can help in evacuations, so that timely evacuations could be carried out. Is that clear? Next, the role of local community was highlighted in disaster management, which I was stressing from the first class. From the first class under disaster management, for every disaster, I was pointing out how important local communities will be in assisting the government authorities in responding to disasters in order to contain the damage. Because local communities can always provide effective response. If local communities are better aware, if they are trained, right, the local people can contribute to disaster management efforts. They need not wait for government forces to respond. So involvement of local community in planning and preparedness is extremely important, and this principle was highlighted under Yokohama strategy. Next, the importance of reducing vulnerability and as well as deploying necessary technology in disaster management was highlighted by Yokohama strategy. And finally, focusing on environment protection to deal with the socio-economic impact of disasters. Because as I explained, disasters such as these can increase poverty levels. If you don't tackle them, if you don't bring down the environmental risks, if you don't prevent and mitigate disasters, it will have a huge socio-economic impact, especially on the poor people, right? So your socio-economic goals will be impacted. So that's why Yokohama strategy urged governments to focus on environment protection, because it's consistent with poverty alleviation goals. It made the world realize that if you have to tackle poverty, if you have to improve your socio-economic indicators, then you have to protect your environment and deal with disasters effectively. And finally, each country was asked to take the primary responsibility for protecting its people and its infrastructure. Every country was urged to mobilize the required resources to deal with disasters. And especially developed countries were asked to help developing underdeveloped countries. This is a very, very important principle because the UN recognized the disproportionate impact of disasters. The countries agreed that disasters have a bigger impact on developing nations and underdeveloped nations. So developed countries were urged to give support, to give assistance to developing nations, low income and middle income countries, so they can withstand the impact of disasters. So these 10 principles were brought out under Yokohama strategy, which essentially laid the framework for the disaster management cycle. This is what brought out the 3 stages in disaster management. It introduced a structured, holistic response to disaster management with pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster measures. Is that clear? The DM cycle we studied at the beginning of the subject, and the various disasters we covered, right? Everywhere I kept talking about disaster management cycle. Where do you think this originated from? It originated from here. These principles that were laid down, it gave a structured approach to disaster management. a structured, holistic approach was introduced through Yokohama strategy. It cemented the DM cycle with pre-disaster planning and preparedness, during disaster response and relief, post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. So these concepts were introduced which formed the DM cycle that we implement today. Is that clear? If you look at the 10 principles, all the key terminologies, that is prevention, preparedness, relief and recovery, relief and response first and then recovery, reconstruction, rehabilitation, all these key concepts were introduced by the Yokohama strategy. It promoted understanding of hazards and vulnerability. Correct? So all these key concepts were introduced, including the importance of early warning and forecasting. Is that clear? So please remember the contribution of Yokohama strategy. Now you guys don't have to mug up these principles. Of course, 10 points, it's too much, right? You don't have to mug up every single point as it is. Just understand the flow. Remember that these key concepts of disaster management cycle were introduced by Yokohama strategy. And present this in your own words. Is that clear? There might be a essay topic asking you to talk about the global framework in disaster management, how it has evolved. So there, of course, you will have to talk a little about Yokohama strategy, highlight its contribution. So mention that it was the first world conference that brought countries together, introduced a proactive, holistic approach on disaster management, and prioritized 10 principles that brought out these concepts, which led to the disaster management cycle. It introduced a structured, holistic response to deal with disasters. Right? So you can explain these points in your own words without mugging it up. Is that clear? Now, let us compare this with the next framework, the Hyogo framework for action, which replaced the Yokohama strategy. Yokohama strategy was in place for almost 10 years, from 1994 to 2004, and it was replaced by the next framework, which is Hyogo framework for action. It was brought out through the Hyogo conference of 2005, and it was implemented until 2015. Now, Hyogo framework is seen as an improvement. It is seen as an improvement over the Yokohama strategy. Because see, under Yokohama strategy, there were still some gaps. Even though it played a big role in streamlining disaster management, if you observe the 10 principles, there are certain gaps that you can figure out. Under Yokohama strategy, there were no set goals, no targets, no deadlines. There were mere principles. It was only preaching certain principles to the countries. This was seen as a shortcoming of Yokohama strategy. Even though it laid the groundwork for disaster management and streamlined its approach in governance, it did not have any goals or any targets, any priority areas. No deadlines were given, and no set funding mechanism was set up. So these details were missing. The specific details of implementation, that was missing. It only laid out the principles without defining what the goals and targets are, without implementing the tools needed for achieving those principles, without identifying the priority areas, without setting deadlines. So to fix this, Yokohama conference brought out Hyogo framework. Under Hyogo framework, 5 specific priorities for action were identified. This includes making disaster risk reduction a priority. The concept of disaster risk reduction was brought out, which is lying at the intersection of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. It urged countries to understand hazards better to reduce vulnerability and exposure so that disaster risk reduction can be achieved. The disaster risk can be brought down in order to prevent and mitigate the impact of disasters. So the concept of DRR, disaster risk reduction, was brought out. It was made a priority. It asked countries to prioritize early warning and risk information, because early warning is critical. As we saw in every disaster, if you have to prevent them or mitigate them, early warning systems forecasting is absolutely essential. This was made a priority through Hyogo framework. It introduced a culture of safety and resilience as a priority, creating the ecosystem where the government, the people, and the civil society and private industries, they all should focus on creating a culture of safety, promoting disaster management planning in every aspect of life. So creating that resilience at the community level within the society is very important. So this was made a priority. Reducing risk in key sectors, especially in critical infrastructure, was made a priority. Because if critical infrastructure is damaged through disasters, then as I have explained in previous classes, it will set back the region by many decades with regard to its development. Now imagine if an earthquake or a cyclone has destroyed railway lines and power cables and power plants. If critical infrastructure is damaged and destroyed by disasters, that region will become backward. It will lose 10, 20 years of development. Essentially, the region will go back in time. Normalcy will not be present in such a region. That is why it prioritized reducing risks in key sectors, that is especially critical infrastructure. And finally, called for better preparedness to provide efficient response during disaster. These 5 were identified as priority areas for the countries which had adopted the goals of Yokohama strategy. The principles streamlined disaster management, and now set of priority areas were given to countries. So India adopted both of them. We drew inspiration from Yokohama strategy and Hyogo framework. We drew inspiration from Yokohama and Hyogo, and we incorporated this into our Disaster Management Act in 2005. Is that clear? The concept of disaster management cycle, priority for early warning, focus on disaster risk reduction, creating a culture of safety and resilience, protecting critical infrastructure, cooperating with other countries. All these principles and priority areas were drawn by India from Yokohama framework and Hyogo framework, and we incorporated this into our Disaster Management Act. Is that clear? This is where India transformed its approach in disaster management. Because prior to this, we suffered 3 major disasters, as I have pointed out in previous classes. The super cyclone in Odisha, the Byjus earthquake in Gujarat, the 2004 tsunami that destroyed Tamil Nadu. These 3 disasters prior to 2004, they were a wake-up call for India, and India drew from these UN principles and priorities and adopted them to enact the Disaster Management Act. It's one of the biggest achievements of the then Manmohan Singh government, one of the landmark legislations, as it transformed DM governance in our country. Prior to this, disaster management was just an emergency response. After this, disaster management became part of mainstream governance, day-to-day governance. So from central government to state government to district authorities, at every level, today there is focus on disaster management. Today there is priority given at all layers of the governance to create the culture of safety and resilience. So the DM Act introduced that legal change and established a legal framework in India, which was built on the principles and priorities of Yokohama and Hyogo. Is that clear? So 10 years later, the UN has replaced Hyogo framework with Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. This is part of UN Sustainable Development Goals that focuses on disaster risk reduction. Under Agenda 2030 of the UN, one of the Sustainable Development Goal is to reduce disasters, prevent disasters, mitigate the impact of disasters, and achieve disaster risk reduction by the end of this decade. So to create a development goal for the next 15 years, in 2015, SDG goals were adopted that focused on disaster management, and the Third World Conference was held at Sendai in Japan, which introduced the Sendai framework. This is a bigger improvement on Hyogo framework. Now see, under Hyogo framework, even though priority areas were identified, still targets and deadlines were not given. If you noticed, Yokohama gave principles, broad preaching principles. Hyogo improved on it by giving some priority areas, but still goals were not identified, targets were not set, deadlines were not set. And there was no word on finance, no word on technology sharing. So to provide this final clarity, the Third World Conference at Sendai introduced the Sendai framework. It's a 15-year voluntary non-binding agreement that guides countries, global institutions, multilateral organizations, and even private companies in dealing with disasters of the future. The priority here is disaster risk reduction, and Sendai framework has clearly identified the risk posed by disasters. It has defined that we are witnessing a massive rise in disasters. The frequency has gone up, the magnitude has gone up due to climate change. So it called for a reduction in disaster risk to save lives, to minimize damage to the economy, to protect infrastructure, protect the environment. So with this goal, specific targets have been laid out under Sendai framework. And this is something you have to remember. I'll show you the specific goals and targets. All right, it's very clearly defined, and you have to remember this both for your prelims and mains. So these goals are essentially in line with UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's an improvement on Hyogo framework and Yokohama strategy. Is that clear? Now please stay with me for the next few minutes. What I'm mentioning is very, very important. 4 specific priorities for action were identified along with few specific targets. 7 global targets, all right, and 4 priorities. This is where Sendai framework is different from Hyogo framework and Yokohama strategy. It has not only identified the focus areas for action, but specific targets have been given. 7 global targets have been given. The first priority is to understand disaster risk, which is again risk analysis. Second, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. That is, you have to improve your governance mechanisms at the central government level, state level, and district level. Provide for better governance in the field of disaster risk reduction to manage the disaster risk, to reduce vulnerability and exposure. Invest in disaster risk reduction for building resilience. Making communities resilient is a priority under Sendai framework. For that, adequate investments have to be made. Enough budgetary allocation has to be made by countries to build resilience at community level. All right. And the last one, build back better. That is, after a disaster, after the impact of the disaster, to focus on recovery, to reconstruct, rebuild all the damages, the infrastructure, and rehabilitate the people who have lost their homes and livelihood. Build back better became the mantra, which is the 4th priority under Sendai framework. This again complements the DM cycle. It's only pointing out the priorities in the DM cycle. All right. Risk analysis, that is understanding disaster risk in the pre-disaster phase. In the pre-disaster phase of DM cycle, you focus on risk analysis and understanding disaster risk. Then under pre-disaster, as part of your preparedness, you strengthen your governance, disaster risk governance, to manage the disaster risk. You provide enough budgetary allocation to build resilience at community level. And finally, in post-disaster phase, you focus on build back better. That is, whatever damage has been caused with a disaster, you have to build it back. Rebuild the infrastructure, rebuild the livelihoods, bring normalcy back to the affected region. That is how you can truly mitigate the impact of a disaster. So these 4 priorities were set by Sendai framework, which is depicted in this infographic over here. Now, you can expect a mains question on this. UPSC might ask you to talk about Sendai framework, its priorities and targets. So with a brief explanation, try and draw an infographic like this. Draw a flow chart with Sendai framework priority at the center and the 4 priorities around it. Priority 1, 2, 3, and 4. Is that clear? This makes your answer more intuitive, right? It's a better way of presenting the answer because you're highlighting 4 priorities. That is disaster risk, strengthening governance, investments for resilience, and build back better. You can showcase this as a flow chart or as a small pictorial representation, which always adds value to your answer. Then, of course, you talk about the 7 identified global targets. Is that clear? 7 specific targets. The measures also have been given. Indicators have been identified. And quantifiable targets, measurable targets have been provided through Sendai framework. All right. This might be a little difficult for you to remember initially, but with revision, it will become easier. There's no other way. All right. There is a small image I've added at the end, an infographic again, to help you visualize and picturize the targets. And there's a technique as well, which I'll explain. But you have to revise the targets again and again. All right. Don't ignore this. Please read the 7 targets repeatedly. Please revise because it is factual. You have to learn this again and again. The first target is to reduce global mortality rate by 2030 because of disasters. That is to reduce the death rate, the death count because of disasters. And a specific goal has been given. The aim is to lower average per 1 lakh global deaths between 2020 to 2030 as compared to 2005 to 2015. That is per 1 lakh people, the number of disaster related deaths has to be reduced compared to the previous average. All right, the data will be measured from 2020 to 2030 and compared with 2005 to 2015. So the average deaths per 1 lakh population because of disasters has to be reduced. Because the biggest impact of disaster is on human life. Loss of human life is the biggest tragedy occurring from disasters. So the first target is to reduce the death rate, reduce the mortality rate, bring down the global average of deaths compared to the previous decade and ensure that we save more lives. Second target, reduce the number of affected people, reduce the number of injuries, reduce the livelihood loss. Essentially, reduce the number of affected people. This includes the displaced people as well. Bring a reduction in the number of people suffering injuries, disabilities, those who are losing their jobs and livelihood, and those who are getting displaced from their homes because of disasters. Even for this, specific target has been laid out with a clear deadline and an indicator for measurement. Next, third target, reduce the economic loss occurring from disasters as a percentage of GDP. The direct economic loss which is occurring from disasters has to be brought down as a percentage of GDP by the end of the decade. This helps in reducing the economic damage. Next, reduce the damage to critical infrastructure. It could be government machinery, health education facilities, power supply, road, railway network, then any other essential infrastructure, mobile internet connectivity, for example. All these are critical infrastructure, right? Reduce the damage that disasters are causing to your critical infrastructure through a quantifiable method. By the end of the decade, we have to reduce these losses, which is quantifiable compared to previous decades. It's not just a prescriptory target, it's a measurable target which has been given. All right. So the first four targets focus on reducing something, reducing death, that is mortality, reducing the number of people affected, reducing economic loss, and reducing damage to critical infrastructure. So that is the trick. The trick to remember is that your first four targets, target 1 to 4, are focused on reducing something, reducing mortality, reducing the number of people affected, reducing economic loss as a percentage of GDP, reducing damage to critical infrastructure. So that is the trick. If you categorize it like this, it's easy, because the other three targets, target 5 to 7, they're all focused on increasing something. They're all focused on increasing something. That includes increasing the number of countries with national local disaster reduction strategies by 2020. More countries have to adopt the disaster risk reduction strategies through their policies and plans. Increasing international cooperation, bringing countries together bilaterally through multilateral organizations and through United Nations. So increasing or enhancing international cooperation. And finally, the last measure, increasing the availability of multi-hazard early warning systems. Using the latest technology to improve forecasting and early warning, and creating multi-hazard early warning systems. This is the seventh target. Very, very important target. Because many of the early warning systems are interconnected. You don't have to have separate nodal agencies, separate centers for every early warning. You can create a integrated, unified, multi-hazard early warning system. Correct? Now today, IMD is providing a multi-hazard early warning system. IMD is looking at heat wave, cold wave. It is also looking at extreme rainfall, cloudburst, earthquakes, right? So going forward, the goal is to bring all early warning systems, even tsunami early warning system, and with regard to other disasters, bringing them together under a unified multi-hazard early warning system, so that there is a more streamlined approach with regard to forecasting and early warning. All right. So these three targets are focused on increasing something. So you can place them in another category. All right. It's focused on increasing number of countries adopting the disaster risk reduction strategies, increasing international cooperation, and increasing availability of multi-hazard early warning systems. So that is the trick to remember. The first four targets are reducing something. The next three targets are increasing something. So with this small hack, it becomes easier for you to remember the 7 targets. All right. So this is a highly anticipated question. We are in the middle of achieving these targets, the world and India. We are progressing towards achieving these goals by 2030. So UPSC might ask a question. It might ask you to explain what is Sendai framework, what is disaster risk reduction, explain the priority areas and the 7 targets that have been identified. Is that clear? Such a basic question can come. Now, please remember that India has adopted Sendai priorities and targets. Is that clear? We have adopted this into our national disaster management plan that was adopted by the National Disaster Management Authority in 2016. In 2016, 1 year after the Sendai framework, the NDMA, the nodal authority, brought out the National Disaster Management Plan, which was mandated under the DM Act. And under the Disaster Management Plan, we have incorporated these priorities and targets of Sendai framework. So India is in full compliance of the Sendai priorities and targets. Got it? So this almost brings my discussion on the global framework to an end. The last point I would like to raise here is a prelims point, a prelims related fact. UN has an initiative called SPIDER. It's a platform, a UN platform called SPIDER, that stands for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response. It's a global platform that brings space agencies and their space assets together for effective global early warning systems. Since very few countries have such technology, the UN created the platform to share early warning and alerts with all the countries by pooling the resources of all space agencies and their assets. Now, ISRO has few satellites in orbit that can help us in detecting meteorological hazards. NASA, European Space Agency, space agencies of China, Japan, Russia, Israel, right? Only few developed countries and major economies have the ability to deploy space assets for early warning and for emergency response. So sharing space-based assets for disaster management is the priority of the SPIDER platform. Is that clear? After a disaster has happened, satellite pictures and satellite-based information is very crucial for deploying response forces and carrying out search and rescue operations. To understand the extent of damage, to identify people who are trapped and deploy the response forces and rescue people, satellite-based technology is critical. Is that clear? So satellites play a very, very important role in disaster management. Not just in early warning, but also in search and rescue operations while providing emergency relief and response. Also in estimating damage caused by a disaster. So space-based platforms play a key role in disaster management. Since very few countries have the technology, UN SPIDER creates this platform to share this with all countries, to ensure even small countries, island nations, low-income countries, underdeveloped countries, they will all have access to space-based assets if needed by pooling the global resources to improve disaster management. So that initiative, that platform of UN is called UN SPIDER. It stands for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response. So this completes my detailed discussion of the global framework with regard to disaster management. All right. So now let's take a short break. Let's take a 15 minutes break. We'll come back at 7:05 and we'll start with the last part of our discussion, that is disaster management framework in India. We'll talk about the DM Act. We'll discuss the disaster management policy and plan, and also talk about the institutions we have for disaster management. All right. So this is the last part, which we will start 15 minutes later. So please take a short break and come back by 7:05. for modern history, that is post-independence history by Rohit sir. So I think it was an extra class which was pending. So tomorrow, Saturday, 7:30 to 11 a.m. So please don't forget. So let's continue the discussion and let's talk about disaster management in India. Now that you have understood all the basic concepts, you've understood the global framework as well, this is the right time to talk about disaster management framework in India. We'll take a look at the DM Act, what changes were introduced through the DM Act, how India has adopted the principles and targets from Sendai framework, from Hyogo framework and Yokohama strategy, how India has brought out a national policy and a plan which today is guiding our disaster management efforts. So this is all that we have to understand, which will complete the syllabus for our subject. So let's start by talking about the DM Act. As I've told you many times, the Disaster Management Act was a landmark reform, a major legal enactment which transformed disaster management in our country and made it a part of day-to-day governance. It mainstreamed disaster management in India across all the three tiers of the government: the national government, state governments, and district authorities. Across all government departments and agencies, disaster management became a part of day-to-day governance, mainstream governance. It essentially created an institutional architecture. It provided for the establishment of new institutions to exclusively deal with disasters in India. It created the necessary legal framework. It identified the responsibility of the center, states, and district authorities. It provided for financial arrangements and also coordination mechanisms between the center, states, and district authorities. So that is how Disaster Management Act transformed disaster management in India. It provided a proactive and holistic approach and implemented the disaster management cycle. It provided for pre-disaster planning and preparedness. It introduced better response and relief measures. It also put focus on post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. So by establishing these institutions, the disaster management architecture was created for the country. And that is the biggest achievement of this law. It focused on a proactive mechanism, focused on preparedness, mitigation, prevention, reconstruction, and recovery, and created this three-tier structure, which today provides for disaster management and disaster risk reduction in India. So we will be studying about the different institutions that were created, the architecture that has been created, the funds that have been established. What's the role of the central government? What's the role of the state governments? What's the function of the district authorities? If we understand this, it basically completes our comprehensive discussion on disaster management. So through this law, 9 important institutions were set up. First was the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority. The NDMA was established as the apex body, the highest level decision-making body to deal with disasters in India. Similarly, at the state level, State Disaster Management Authority, SDMA, was established. And at the district level, the DDMAs were established. Is that clear? So this forms the three-tier architecture for disaster management. A three-tier response mechanism has been created at the national level, state level, and district level. So the highest level bodies have been set up, starting with NDMA, the apex body, followed by SDMAs at the state level, and DDMAs at the district level. We will study the role of these authorities as well. I'll come to that later. Apart from that, the Act established the national and state executive committees. These executive committees essentially implement, they execute the policy decisions that are made by the authorities. Is that clear? Whatever policy decisions NDMA takes, it will be implemented by the National Executive Committee. Policy decisions taken by State Disaster Management Authority will be executed by the state level executive committee. All right. So two new institutions were set up, the National Executive Committee and State Executive Committee, to implement the policy decisions of the disaster management authorities. A dedicated response force, NDRF, with State Disaster Response Force as well, was established. At the national level, we have a disaster response force called NDRF, and every state has its own SDRF, State Disaster Response Forces, as well, to provide for immediate relief and rescue operations following a disaster. With regard to finance, the law proposed the establishment of two funds, a National Disaster Response Fund and a National Disaster Mitigation Fund. Is that clear? But out of the two funds, only the first one, the NDRF, has been established. Only the National Disaster Response Fund has been established with a State Disaster Response Fund. Whereas the National Disaster Mitigation Fund, this is yet to be established. All right, that's the current status. So let me give you a quick explanation on what is National Disaster Response Fund and what is National Disaster Mitigation Fund. How are they different? Disaster Response Fund provides for immediate funding after a disaster to the states to help them conduct the rescue operations, to provide relief, to provide immediate compensation. That's what you mean by a response fund. During disaster and after disaster, to conduct the operations, the search and rescue operations, to provide medical assistance, to provide food and provide other essential supplies, and to provide some immediate compensation to the victims. Funds are needed. So this fund is called the response fund. It is meant only for response operations, relief operations. So there is a NDRF at the national level, and at every state you have state disaster response funds meant for response and relief. So these funds have been established as per the law. But disaster mitigation fund is yet to be established. It has not been set up by the government. Mitigation fund was supposed to give finances for mitigation projects. That is for preventive planning, preparedness measures through which we can mitigate the impact of a disaster. Like, for example, to build retention walls in landslide areas, mitigation funds will be needed. To build cyclone shelters, some mitigation funds will be needed. So the DM Act had proposed a separate fund for mitigation initiatives. But since government does not have the kind of resources, it has not yet set up the mitigation fund. Is that clear? It's almost 18 years now since the law was enacted, but the central government has not established the mitigation fund. Only the response fund has been set up, the National and State Disaster Response Fund, to provide for immediate response and relief operations. The final institution that was set up is the NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management, which functions under NDMA. So this is the architecture created by the DM Act. 9 institutions were created. NDMA, SDMA, and DDMA as the highest decision-making bodies. 2 executive committees at national and state level to implement and execute the policy decisions of the national and state disaster management authorities. A disaster response force at national level and state level. Disaster response fund at national and state level with a mitigation fund which has not been set up. And NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management, which acts like a think tank under university. It basically conducts research in the field of disaster management. It provides training courses. It provides capacity building programs. It comes out with research which is helping the disaster management authorities to come out with their disaster response. So NIDM is an institute. It's like an academic institute, like a university or a research institution or a think tank that's focusing on the field of disaster management. So this is the architecture set up by the Disaster Management Act. All right. Now, let's look at these institutions one by one. We'll understand the composition, the role, and what functions do these institutions actually perform. We'll start with the apex body, the highest level decision-making body, that is NDMA. The National Disaster Management Authority. It's headed by the Prime Minister of the country. The serving Prime Minister becomes ex officio chairperson of NDMA. Is that clear? The structure of NDMA, the composition, is important for your prelims. Understanding its role and functions can be important for your mains. So please note down that the chairperson of NDMA is the Prime Minister. He's the ex officio chairperson. I hope everyone understands what is ex officio. You would have studied this in polity. Ex officio means by virtue of holding one position, you automatically hold another position. Like the Vice President of India. Vice President of India, by being the Vice President, by virtue of being the Vice President of the country, he or she becomes the ex officio chairperson of Rajya Sabha. Understood? That's what you mean by ex officio. The Vice President of India, by virtue of being the Vice President, becomes the chairperson of Rajya Sabha automatically. So like that, Prime Minister of India, by virtue of being the Prime Minister, automatically becomes the chairperson of NDMA. That's what you mean by ex officio chairperson. To head the day-to-day functioning of NDMA, there is a vice chairperson, a vice chairman, who heads the NDMA on a day-to-day basis, who's appointed by the Prime Minister, and it can have a maximum of 9 members nominated by the PM. So essentially, the government is the appointing authority. Of course, appointments happen in the name of the president, as the president is the head of the executive, but the appointments are chosen by the PM, the chairman of NDMA. So there is a vice chairman who heads the NDMA on a day-to-day basis, and a maximum of 9 members. These members could be retired IAS or IPS officers with sufficient expertise in disaster management, officers from armed forces, experts from various sectors, including ISRO, maybe DRDO, the IMD, right? And as well as academicians. So such people of repute who have proven track record in the field of disaster management in dealing with various kinds of disasters, who have experience in finance, experience in emergency relief operations, right? So such members are appointed by the Prime Minister. All right. Though it could have representation from armed forces, the bureaucracy, experts from key institutions, scientific institutions, and also from the academia and other experts who have proven knowledge and experience in the field of disaster management. So please make a note of this. PM is the chairperson, ex officio chairperson. There's a vice chairman and maximum of 9 full-time members. Now, what is the role of NDMA? What does it do? As the apex body, as the highest level decision making body, it basically lays down the policies. It notifies the disaster management policy, disaster management plan, and comes out with the guidelines. Now, if you visit the website of NDMA, there you can see the National Disaster Management Policy, which has been notified by NDMA. This policy was notified in the year 2009. Got it? If you come back to the slide here, the National Disaster Management Policy of 2009, it provides the broad framework for disaster management in India for various disasters. It lays down the approach for various disasters in the country. So the national policy that was notified in 2009 was done by NDMA after extensive research and thought. After a lot of discussions, debate, and deliberations, a broad policy framework was adopted that defines India's approach towards all disasters. So, under the policy, a specific plan had to be brought out. Plan defines the specific measures. It defines each initiative, the mechanisms to be created, essentially the details, the nitty-gritties, and it has to be in line with the policy. Based on the policy notified by NDMA, a plan is prepared specifically for each disaster. Got it? For every disaster, a specific plan with what kind of measures, what kind of mechanisms have to be adopted, what initiatives have to be taken. Everything is described in detail in the plan for every single disaster by incorporating Sendai framework priorities and targets. And who prepares the plan? The plan is prepared by National Executive Committee. Got it? Policy is prepared by NDMA, notified by NDMA. The broad policy is prepared and notified by NDMA. Both are done by NDMA itself. But the plan will be prepared by the Executive Committee, National Executive Committee. It spells out every single detail of dealing with each disaster in line with Sendai framework commitments. This plan is presented to the NDMA by National Executive Committee, and NDMA approves the plan. It's the NDMA which will approve and notify the National Disaster Management Plan, which was done in 2016, immediately after Sendai framework. That is after Sendai Convention. All right, I'll repeat this point. To provide for disaster management, NDMA's primary role was to come out with a broad policy approach. Accordingly, a policy was adopted and notified in 2009 by the NDMA itself. NDMA itself prepared the policy and notified it. It gave the broad approach for every disaster and the framework was laid out. Accordingly, various guidelines were notified for various disasters, what to do, what not to do. All right, if you visit the website of NDMA, you can take a look at this. You can see what guidelines have been given to the public, what you should do during earthquakes, what you shouldn't do during floods. Those specific guidelines and the broad policy framework has been defined. But what we really needed was a plan, a specific plan with all the details. This plan was prepared by National Executive Committee according to our Sendai commitments. It gave the specific measures and mechanisms in line with the policy, and this has been approved and notified by NDMA. This is how we fulfilled our commitment to Sendai framework. Got it? So that is the primary role of NDMA. coming out with the policy, which was done in 2009, approving the plan brought out by National Executive Committee, which was done in 2016, and bringing out guidelines for every disaster. Essentially, it's a policy making body. It's the highest level policy making body for disaster management in the country. Clear? Apart from that, it also lays down the minimum standards for providing disaster relief and response, the basic standards expected in search and rescue operations, in providing medical assistance, in giving other emergency supplies. Those basic minimum standards are laid out. It also has command control over NDRF. The Disaster Response Force, NDRF, is directly under the command of NDMA. The superintendent's direction and control of NDRF, that is the National Disaster Response Force, has been placed under the Disaster Management Authority, under NDMA. This is a key function of NDMA. So NDMA decides the establishment of NDRF forces, allocation of funds for their training, procuring equipment for them, preparing them, deploying them in different parts of the country. All those decisions regarding NDRF is made by NDMA. Then NIDM, the National Institute of Disaster Management, also functions under NDMA. The NIDM, which is a research institute, an academic institute, it comes out with training modules, conducts research into disasters and disaster management, provides training programs for response forces and other government officials. So this institute functions under NDMA. Clear? These are the primary roles and functions of NDMA. Bringing out the policy, approving the plan, coming out with guidelines, laying out the minimum standards, coordinating and controlling the NDRF and NIDM, and also achieving coordination with all the stakeholders, with central ministries, with state governments, district level authorities, armed forces, etc. Achieving coordination at the national level is also one of the roles that NDMA performs by working with other concerned ministries, state governments and other agencies and district level authorities. Is that clear? So please be in a position to give this basic explanation. It's very factual, nothing much to explain here. Once you understand what exact role it performs, it's very easy to present these facts. Now coming to National Executive Committee. What is the composition? What is the role? That's what we should understand. The National Executive Committee is headed by the Union Home Secretary as the chairperson. Please remember this fact. The Home Secretary in the Ministry of Home Affairs is the chairperson. The reason why Home Secretary has been made the chairperson is because MHA is the nodal ministry for disaster management. Disaster is an internal threat. It's an internal risk. It involves center-state relations as well, right? So Home Ministry is the nodal ministry, whereas NDMA is the nodal agency. It's the apex decision-making body for disaster management. Home Ministry plays a key role in disaster management as well by achieving coordination with states, by working with all stakeholders. So as MHA is the nodal ministry, the Home Secretary has been made the chairperson of the National Executive Committee. Along with the Home Secretary, it includes all the top secretaries of the Government of India, from all important ministries, departments, and even armed forces and foreign ministry. All the key ministries are brought together through their secretaries. So that is the National Executive Committee for you. Essentially, it involves the bureaucracy, the highest bureaucrats, the top secretaries of the government. For example, the Finance Secretary from Finance Ministry, the Secretary from Ministry of Earth Sciences, under which IMD inquiries are functioning, the secretaries of Department of Space, Department of Telecommunication, Ministry of Health, all the secretaries from these key ministries, government departments are part of this executive committee. It also includes the service chiefs, the Chief of Integrated Defense Staff, the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the Chief of Defense Staff, the CDS, who provides integration for the armed forces, right? All these top officials from the civilian bureaucracy and the military bureaucracy are part of the executive committee under the Union Home Secretary. So their task is to implement the policies and decisions of NDMA, provide advice to the NDMA, and also achieve coordination with concerned stakeholders. This is the role of National Executive Committee. As part of this task was to come out with the disaster management plan, the National Disaster Management Plan. So the Executive Committee brought out the specific plan in 2016, which was approved by, is that clear? So Executive Committee, which includes all the top government officials, the secretaries, implements the policies and decisions of NDMA and the government, advises the NDMA, and achieves coordination. And that is the role of the National Executive Committee. Now, if this is clear, it's very easy to understand what SDMA and what State Executive Committee does. It's exactly the same. It's replicated at the state level. All right. So please make a note of the powers and functions of National Executive Committee as well. Got it? It prepares the national plan, comes out with specific guidelines for various ministries, gives any assistance, achieves coordination, and advises the NDMA and the government. That is the role of National Executive Committee. Next, SDMA, State Disaster Management Authority. It is headed by the Chief Minister of the state. At the state level, this will be the apex body. It will be the highest decision-making body at the state level, headed by the CM. Is that clear? The CM will appoint a vice chairperson and few members as well. So essentially, SDMA provides for the policy at the state level. Got it? It approves the state plan, which is created by the National Executive Committee and approved by NDMA. But of course, the state policy and plan, it should be in line with the national policy and plan. It can't be completely different and contradict the national policy and plan. Is that clear? So once NDMA came out with the national policy and finally approved the national plan, which was prepared by National Executive Committee, based on that, every state was expected to come out with their own state policy and plan. And this is the role and task of SDMA. The SDMA, headed by the CM, brings out the state policy and approves the state plan that's prepared by the State Executive Committee. Got it? So it can't contradict the national policy and plan. It has to draw from the national policy and plan, and based on that, create customized plan for the concerned state. This provides for customization. It provides for decentralization. Because in every state, the challenges are different. The disasters faced are different. The geography is different, right? The finances available, the technology available is different. So based on that, every state has to come out with its own customized state policy and plan, which is in line with national policy and plan. That is the role of SDMA, headed by the Chief Minister of the state. The State Executive Committee, which assists the SDMA, is headed by the Chief Secretary of the state. Chief Secretary, I hope you know, is the highest ranking civil servant in a state. Just like you have Cabinet Secretary, who's the highest ranking civil servant in the country and at the central government. Similarly, you have a Chief Secretary who heads the state administration, and he is the highest ranking bureaucrat. He or she is the highest ranking bureaucrat in the state. So under the Chief Secretary, you have the State Executive Committee that comes out with the state plan, that prepares the state plan. It includes all the top secretaries of state departments, all the important secretaries, the Home Secretary, Finance Secretary, Rural Development Secretary, Health Secretary. They head all the state departments, right? They're all part of the State Executive Committee under the Chief Secretary, and they prepare the state plan, which is in line with the national policy, national plan, and the state policy. And this will be finally approved by the SDMA. Is that clear? It's the same arrangement. If you understood NDMA and NEC, SDMA and SEC is pretty much the same. Then comes the last tier of disaster management, the DDMA, the Disaster Management Authority at the district level, right? This will be headed by the district collector, the DC. I'm sure you would have heard about this position. It's always occupied by an IAS officer. Usually a young to mid-senior IAS officer is appointed as a district collector. This designation is known by different names in different states, but the role is exactly the same. So at the district level, the DC or DM will be the highest civil servant, highest ranking civil servant. It's under him or her, the whole district administration is placed, including revenue, land, even law and order, and as well as disaster management. That's why IAS officers play a critical role in disaster management. They are the ones who will finally implement all the policies and decisions at the ground level. They are the ones who play a critical role in response. When alerts are sounded, when early warning is given, when disaster is happening or it has already happened, the DDMA plays a critical role under the charge of the district collector or deputy commissioner or district magistrate. These are different names given in different states. Is that clear? In Karnataka, the role is called deputy commissioner. In UP, it is DM, district magistrate. In Andhra Pradesh, it is district collector. The name changes from state to state, but the position is exactly the same. Got it? So under this IAS officer, the command of the entire district disaster management authority is placed, and it plays a key role in planning, coordinating, and implementing the policy and plan. The policy and plan, which is approved by NDMA and SDMA, will finally be implemented at the grassroots through your DDMA. So here the IPS officers also play a critical role, the superintendent of police of the district. Even they are part of the committee. All right. Along with the DC, the SP also plays a very important role. And also some elected officials at the panchayat level, even they will have representation. Panchayat officials, they will also have representation at the DDMA. So this authority at the grassroots provides for the implementation of the policy and the plan. Is that clear? It plays the most important role. It will work with the state government, it will work with NDRF and SDRF. And if required, the DC also has the powers to call armed forces for assistance. Is that clear? The DC, who is heading the DDMA, if they determine that NDRF or SDRF forces are not enough, or if they are not immediately available, and if the civilian administration is overwhelmed by a disaster, if they're not able to handle the situation, the DC can directly call in the armed forces by reaching out to the command centers. The DC need not even get approvals from the state government or the central government. That is the tremendous power given to the DC. Is that clear? In case of emergencies, the DC can reach out to the military leadership at the command centers and call for military assistance to deal with disasters immediately. So that is why I told you that DDMA plays a very, very important role. The district plan is prepared and implemented here. This is what provides for true decentralization in our disaster management policy and plan. Just having a national policy and plan, state policy and plan will not be enough. Our country is so diverse geographically that every district, every village needs a separate plan. Depending on the terrain, the weather, the climate, and all the other socio-economic conditions, right? And the hazards present in each district, separate plans will have to be created. That is where the DDMA plays a very important role. All right. Of course, the district plan will be in line with the national policy and plan and state policy and plan. Based on that, district plans are prepared and implemented through the DDMA. So this is the basic architecture created in India for disaster management governance. That's why the subject is important in our exams. As future bureaucrats, as future IAS, IPS officers, IFS officers, you will be playing a role in disaster management. It's a part of your job description. So understanding these concepts, acknowledging the mechanisms we have, understanding the architecture is very, very important. Now, coming to the response force, the dedicated National Disaster Response Force. So the DM Act provided for a specialized force to provide emergency relief and response. As I told you in previous classes, to deal with disasters, you need specialized training, you need special equipment, special resources. You can't rely on your regular armed forces and police forces, right? They do pitch in and help, but you need specialized forces which are specializing in managing different disasters. Now, if there are floods or tsunamis or cyclones, you need specialist divers. They need inflatable boats and life jackets and diving equipment as well. While dealing with earthquakes, landslides, the forces will need gas cutters and earth moving equipment and heavy lifting equipment like cranes, JCBs, etc. They'll need thermal scanners to scan the debris and see if anyone is trapped inside. They will need drones, robots if required, dog squads. So all such facilities are needed for them. These resources are needed, right? So you need a specialist force. You can't rely on your regular armed forces or police forces for this. That's why the DM Act provided for a specialist force, which is raised under NDMA. NDMA has superintendents over NDRF, and initially 8 battalions were constituted in 2006. Today, we have 12 battalions. And it's not a completely new force, by the way. It's not that we raised the force from scratch. We didn't recruit members freshly and then train them. What India did was we pulled forces from CAPFs to form the NDRF. What is CAPF? Central Armed Police Forces under the Home Ministry, which includes BSF, ITBP, SSB, CISF, Assam Rifles, and the others. So these are your Central Armed Police Forces under the Home Ministry. They deal with internal security, border management, counterinsurgency. That is their primary role. But few battalions in CAPFs, they had been trained in disaster management. So these forces were drawn and permanently shifted from CAPFs to NDRF. So now it's a permanent force. It's a specialist force which has its own recruitment as well. But initially, when it was raised, the forces were drawn from existing CAPFs and they were given highly specialized training along with all the required equipment, technology, and resources. This is what makes NDRF different. It's a specialist force of 12 battalions with 1,000 plus personnel in each battalion. So we have close to 12 to 14,000 personnel in this specialized force, which today is deployed around the country. Is that clear? So we have drawn them from BSF, CRPF, and other central armed police forces and given them highly specialized training, given them all the resources, and they are self-contained search and rescue teams. It means they are independent. They can operate independently. They don't need any outside support. They don't depend on other forces and organizations for support. They have their own resources and equipment through which they will effectively conduct search and rescue operations during disasters. They will have their own team of engineers, technicians, electricians, even doctors and paramedics, dog squads, and all the other equipment that is necessary, from torchlight to batteries to communication equipment, right, to boats, motors for boats, then life jackets, then firefighting equipment, cranes, JCBs, you name it, all kind of resources are given to them that is necessary to deal with disasters and to carry out search and rescue operations. And the best part is that the NDRF is not a centralized force. It's not placed in one location. To make them effective and to reduce the response time, they have been pre-positioned around the country. They are strategically deployed around the country. Is that clear? They're not stationed only in Delhi or only in one place. The 12 battalions are distributed all across the country. This is called proactive availability and pre-positioning. Those battalions that specialize in cyclone and tsunami management, they are stationed more towards the east coast of India. Those battalions specializing in earthquakes, landslides, floods, they are stationed towards northern India, towards the Himalayan belt. Is that clear? So that is how the distribution has been done. It's a strategic distribution and a pre-deployment and pre-positioning, so that response time is cut. As soon as early warning comes in, within hours, NDRF troops can be positioned. Once a disaster has happened without notice, within hours the forces can respond, right? That is the whole idea here. And they also specialize in CBRN hazards. They have been specially trained to deal with chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear disasters, and they have the specialized equipment for that as well. So this is the biggest achievement of India in the field of disaster management. Many countries do not have such specialized forces. India is one of the few countries in the world which has managed to create such a large specialist force, and today we are helping other countries as well. Is that clear? So this map gives you an idea about how NDRF forces are pre-positioned. You don't have to remember this, but just know that they are strategically placed in different parts of the country to reduce the response time. There are forces stationed in Guwahati, in West Bengal, Chhattisgarh, Andaman, Nicobar and Kerala belt, in Maharashtra, Vadodara, etc. You can see how NDRF forces are strategically distributed around the country so that they can respond quickly and reduce the response time. And also the decision is very smart. They calculate the risk as well, the risk of deployment. Now imagine if the specialist NDRF team that specializes in earthquakes, if it is stationed only near Himalayan belt, what if a mega earthquake wipes out the force itself? So strategically, they are placed a little away as well. In safer places, there are NDRF teams stationed so that they themselves have to be safe. The first responders have to be protected first from the impact of a disaster. What if an NDRF team gets caught in the cyclone? You can't afford that. So they are strategically pre-positioned by taking all the risk factors into account. They should be close enough, but not right in the line of damage. Right? Because what if the disaster affects the forces first and they themselves are trapped? They can't come to rescue them. So all these risk factors have been taken into account, and strategically the forces are pre-positioned to reduce their response time. So similarly, every state has raised its own SDRF, State Disaster Response Force. SDRF is mainly drawn from State Reserve Police. From the State Police and State Reserve Police forces, personnel have been drawn to form SDRF, and they have been trained with state funds. They complement the NDRF. Is that clear? So these response forces can be deployed by the NDMA in coordination with SDMA and DDMA. All right. Finally, the DDMA takes a call on their deployment, where they will operate. The district collector plays a critical role here in deciding where the response forces will be sent, where exactly they should be sent for rescue and relief operations. Then the last one, NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management. As I told you, it's a knowledge-based institution. It's an academic institution conducting research, developing training modules, conducting training programs to enhance the capacity of all government officials. It's been recognized as a center of excellence in the field of disaster management. So IAS probationers, IPS probationers, they are put through training at NIDM. They're made to undergo a disaster management course. Then NDRF, SDRF personnel, essentially government officials, are given the required training based on these training modules and programs prepared by NIDM. Even foreign governments get their officials trained through NIDM. Friendly countries send their disaster management officials to India to get training from NIDM. They work with NIDM and any NDRF to get training and improve their capacities to deal with disasters. So small friendly countries like Maldives, Sri Lanka, and many others, right? They take the help of NIDM to access the training modules and get the training programs for their government officials as well. It's part of our diplomacy. So this is the basic architecture created by the Disaster Management Act. Now, please take a look at this flow chart. It gives you a broad idea on how the interaction happens between central and state agencies and institutions. You are looking at the national level disaster management mechanism. You have Home Ministry as the nodal ministry, NDMA, the apex body for disasters, concerned specific ministries, Cabinet Committee on Security whenever necessary. It's headed by the PM and includes Home Minister, Finance Minister, Defense Minister, and External Affairs Minister. Cabinet Committee on Security is the highest decision-making body on security matters, especially for CBRN hazards. Cabinet Committee on Security is needed to deal with the disaster, and also in other disasters as well, to make quick and key decisions. CCS might be needed, which is a top-level body headed by the PM. Then you have a Crisis Management Committee headed by the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, who is the highest ranking civil servant in the country, heads the Crisis Management Committee, which oversees the Executive Committee, the National Executive Committee. Then you have your armed forces and Central Armed Police Forces, NIDM as a research institution, and NDRF and state governments. So this is the architecture that defines center-state relations and coordination while dealing with disasters. They all have their own unique roles, specific roles to perform. Is that clear? I have listed out the role in this table. I've taken this table directly from National Disaster Management Policy that was notified by NDMA. All right. So please take a look at this. What's the composition of CCS? What is its role during disasters? It plays a role especially during CBRN disasters, which is a result of warfare or terrorism. Crisis Management Committee, headed by Cabinet Secretary, which oversees all the relief operations, exercises command control on all the other stakeholders. It's a very high-level decision-making body. NDMA, Executive Committee, right? So having this basic knowledge is very important. If there is a mains question asking you to describe the disaster management architecture in our country, you can depict this like a flow chart. You need not replicate this exactly. You need not copy this exactly. But in your own way of visualization, you can depict this interaction between central and state agencies and highlight the role of different institutions. Similarly, at the state level, you have the state government, the SDMA headed by the CM. This works closely with NDMA. Then central government and ministries, especially MHA and the National Crisis Management Committee, they will be in constant touch with the state government. State Executive Committee headed by the Chief Secretary of the State, State Disaster Response Force, and the concerned local implementing executive agencies with DDMA. So this is the three-tiered architecture for disaster management in India. All right, that's how the decisions flow. That's how the measures and policies are implemented while dealing with disasters. Now, please take a look at the early warning agencies. I've given the entire list for your prelims. Please take a look at this. You have to remember, of course, here you have to memorize this. For avalanches, the agency responsible for risk analysis, for studying and predicting avalanches, is the Snow Avalanche Study Establishment. Cyclones, it's IMD, which we have already covered. Droughts, it's Ministry of Agriculture. Earthquake, IMD. Epidemics, Ministry of Health. Floods, Central Water Commission. Landslides, Geological Survey of India. And tsunamis, INCOIS. Please remember these early warning agencies that focus on specific hazards. This is defined under the National Disaster Management Policy, and it's also mentioned under the National Disaster Management Plan. Is that clear? So UPSC might ask you a straightforward prelims question. Which is the nodal agency for early warning with regard to this hazard? Please remember these points, just 8 of them. It's very simple. Now coming to the finance part of it, coming to the funds. Who provides funds for response and what about the mitigation fund? I already explained at the beginning of this discussion that the DM Act proposed 2 types of funds, a response fund and a mitigation fund. Response fund is for emergency response and the relief operations which have to be carried out. Is that clear? This requires a lot of money. When a disaster is about to happen or when it has already happened, to conduct search and rescue operations, to provide food, medicines, and other essential supplies, to evacuate people, a lot of money is required. And even to give some immediate compensation to the victims, right? Money is required. So to fund these emergency response relief operations during disaster, you need an immediate, readily available fund. You can't sit and wait for funds to come. You can't ask the center. You can't debate how much funds are needed, right? You can't do that when time is of great importance. Responding on time is critical during a disaster. So to provide for that flexibility to the states, this response fund has been created. Is that clear? States have a primary responsibility as far as disaster response is concerned. The center will only complement and assist. Center will complement and assist and provide any additional resources needed. But primary responsibility lies with the state government. So to provide ready funds for response operations, for relief operations, NDRF was proposed by the Disaster Management Act and it has been established. Is that clear? It merges the calamity contingency fund. The Finance Commission had recommended this. We had a calamity contingency fund, all right, which was drawn from the Consolidated Fund of India. This, according to Finance Commission, had to be merged with NDRF to make it more effective and a single source of fund. So this merger has happened, and today from NDRF, funds are given to SDRF. The center provides a dedicated allocation through NDRF into SDRF. So states will have ready funds available to carry out these rescue relief operations without waiting for any funds to come in. Ready funds are available all the time through the year. They need not even wait for the center. Since states have the primary responsibility, they can immediately draw funds from SDRF and fund the emergency response relief operations. So NDRF funds the SDRF, all right? And states withdraw money from here to finance the relief and rescue operations. So this fund has been established. NDRF, SDRF has been established. But the mitigation fund has not been established. Even though the law provides for it, it's been supported by many committees as well. But due to lack of resources, the government of India has not established the mitigation fund to give dedicated funds for mitigation measures. We do implement mitigation measures through regular routes of finance, but we don't have a dedicated fund for mitigation because the government has limited financial resources. So it has postponed this decision to establish the mitigation fund, which was recommended by the Disaster Management Act. So it has not been created yet. All right. So there is no dedicated fund in India for mitigation measures. So NDRF will supplement the State Disaster Response Fund. Now let me explain how this actually works. Understanding this is crucial as part of center-state relations. Because you might have heard every time there is a disaster that state governments, they complain that the center is not giving enough funds. States ask for extra funding and center takes some more time, causing a dispute between central and state governments. There's also an accusation, an allegation that the ruling party at the center is discriminating against states ruled by opposition parties. So states like Kerala, West Bengal, and others have often alleged that center is not giving the supplementary support needed and additional support needed to finance response operations. So let's get some clarity on this. As I told you, states have the primary responsibility to carry out the response measures and to fund them. So SDRF is the primary fund for providing immediate relief according to the law. So the central government has already given funds into the SDRF. 75% of SDRF is contributed by the central government for general category states. For special category states, which have a very difficult geography, less population, less development, which are border states like northeastern states, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Himachal, Jammu and Kashmir, 90% of the funds, 90% of funds into SDRF is given from NDRF by the central government. Is that clear? 75% for SDRF in other states is given already through NDRF. So special category states get 90% funding. 90% of SDRF funds come from center through the NDRF. General category states, all the other states, they get 75% of SDRF funds through NDRF, which means special category states have to raise only 10% more through their own taxes. Northeastern states, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, Uttarakhand and others, as they are getting 90% of the fund from center through the NDRF, The other 10% they raise through their own funding, through their own taxes. General category states have to raise 25% of the funds into SDRF through their own taxes. They levy a surcharge or a cess through their state budget and raise some funds to bring the 25% funds into SDRF, and 75% is coming from NDRF. This is the finance mechanism created, which means every state has already been given an allocation as recommended by the Finance Commission. Now, let's say a state like Kerala. Depending on Kerala's vulnerability, the disasters happening, the impact, center might have allocated 500 crores as SDRF fund, out of which 75% center would have already given, 25% Kerala would have raised on its own, thus creating a 500 crore pool in the SDRF. Now, let's say Kerala has been hit by multiple disasters in the same year. There were floods, there were landslides, then a cyclone hit. So, SDRF funds might get exhausted. If Kerala is getting repeatedly hit, or let's say Uttarakhand, since Uttarakhand is very vulnerable, maybe a fund of 800 crores has been given, SDRF of 800 crores. 90% from center, 10% from Uttarakhand itself, because it's a special category state. Now, let's say Uttarakhand is hit by multiple disasters. It's hit by cloudbursts, floods, landslides, earthquake, and all the money has already been spent by the state government. Only when SDRF funds are exhausted, only when the SDRF funds are not enough, that is when additional funding can be sought from the central government. Because center has already provided, it has already given 90 to 75% for different states to fill their SDRF. So states first have to use the SDRF funds. Once they exhaust this, once they face multiple disasters and exhaust these funds, that is when they have to ask additional funding from the center. Is that clear? So states have suffered from this, like Kerala and few others. They have a big complaint here. They say that the central assistance is not enough. They are saying the funds are exhausted in SDRF and center is not timely providing additional funding. To provide additional funding, there is a mechanism, there is a process to be followed. The process is that the state has to submit a request to the center saying that SDRF is exhausted. We are running out of funds. We are overwhelmed. We need additional funding. This request has to be made. Once the request is made, central government will appoint a committee. It will take the request. It will appoint a evaluation committee which will visit the state to assess disaster impact. The committee, comprising of top officials from NDMA, Executive Committee and other ministries, this central committee will visit the state to review the impact of disasters and the available funds in SDRF. They will submit a report to the central government, and now it will be left to the central government to approve additional funding or not. Is that clear? So central government has the discretion to either provide or hold back additional funds to the state beyond what has been provided to the SDRF. This is where the political controversy comes up. This is where the political controversy has existed. See, providing funds to SDRF is legally mandated. Center can't violate that. Center has to provide by law according to Disaster Management Act. It has to provide 75% to all states and 90% to special states. That's not a charity the central government is doing. It is its duty. Now, some states might run out of the funds if they are hit by multiple disasters. That is when they can ask additional funding. They can ask for more central assistance. And the central government sends a committee. And based on the committee's evaluation report, additional funding may or may not be provided. So central government has the discretion, and this is where the controversy has repeatedly come up. Providing this additional financial assistance has been the crux of the problem. The allegation is that the ruling party discriminates against opposition ruled states. This has led to a political controversy between central and state governments. All right. But please be aware that states can ask additional central assistance beyond what has been provided into the SDRF. But the condition is that they should be running out of those funds and the state should be severely impacted by multiple disasters. So the central committee will evaluate the situation and submits a report. And based on that, central government will have a discretion to provide additional funds or not. Even if it provides, how much should be provided? That's left to the central government. All right. Of course, state can raise the demand. It can ask that this is the amount we need. We need another 400 crores. It can provide justification as well. But the central committee comes and does an evaluation, submits a report, and based on that, the center may or may not approve additional central assistance. All right. So understanding this is very, very important. An interministerial central team conducts the assessment of the damage and the efforts carried out and the funds which have been utilized. So based on this committee's report, the center takes a call whether to provide additional assistance or not. Is that clear? So please understand this. This can come as a question. It's an analytical issue linked with polity, right? It's an aspect of center-state relations. So under NDRF, SDRF, enough funds have been made available through the DM Act. The center has made a financial allocation. In the budget, there is a separate allocation made into NDRF every year. And from NDRF, funds are already given to SDRF. 75% to all states, 90% to special states. Remaining part of SDRF is raised by the concerned state governments through their own local taxes. But if the SDRF is not enough, if they're running out of it, they can ask center for more assistance, and center will send an interministerial team which submits a report, assessment report. Based on it, center may approve or may not approve additional central assistance. Next, talking about finance and assistance, we have to talk about foreign aid. This is another important point. What is our policy if a foreign government or a foreign agency announces an aid following a disaster in India? Let me explain this. I'll open a new slide. I've already given all the points, but let me write it down and explain it clearly. Let's say a friendly foreign country or a foreign agency or a NGO or maybe a international organization like UN, for example. Any of them might announce aid and assistance to India following a disaster. Right? We saw one such incident happening during the recent Kerala floods. It was reported that UAE had announced few $1 million in support to Kerala government. Now the point is, can the state accept those funds? What is the policy we have? What does the Disaster Management Act say? Right? According to the Disaster Management Act, it maintains silence on this front. Explicitly, it has not banned. There is no explicit ban on accepting aid from foreign countries or NGOs or international organizations. Is that clear? It means it is legal. It is allowed. The law does not say anything about it. It's not prohibiting it. Is that clear? It does not restrict states from asking funds or borrowing funds or taking assistance announced by friendly countries or organizations. They can accept it. But however, the DM Act says that it is the center's call. States can't decide on this. This is a matter of foreign policy, right? It's a matter of our national interests. Central government, it has been left to the center. The law says the government may accept. This is what the DM Act says. All right, it says the center can look into it and it may accept any foreign assistance that's coming in. So law has allowed it. All right, but the center has established a norm, it has established a standard that we will not accept foreign support from governments. This is a foreign policy decision of India taken by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and followed by the Modi government. It's like a convention we have formed. The law is not explicitly prohibiting it. It's left the matter to the center to allow such funds and assistance. Center may accept or not. But the central government has put in place a standard protocol that we are not going to accept foreign support from foreign governments. I'll tell you the reason why. See, friendly countries or any country might announce support. It's very common when there are major disasters, they will announce support. They might give financial support. They might send disaster response forces or food or medicines. Now, India will politely reject this. When the request comes in, the foreign ministry will thank the country. We can't be rude. We can't seem to be rude because this is a matter of foreign relations, right? We have to thank those countries which are trying to help us. So our foreign ministry and our embassies abroad, they'll reach out to the governments, will express thank you, will express the gratitude for the concern, the sympathy they have shown. But we will politely refuse the offer. This is the norm laid out by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, which the government of India has been following. That's because when you accept foreign support, it might become an obligation. And you don't want that in foreign policy. It might restrict our foreign policy and impose unnecessary constraints. Because see, foreign policy is all about give and take, reciprocal relationship. You give something, you take something. Today, US might announce $1 million of support for India for a disaster and we take it. Tomorrow, US might expect something in return as a favor. It might expect a concession from India in some critical matter. So that could compromise our national interests and it could restrict and curtail our foreign policy options because we'll come under an obligation of that country. That's why India has taken a call, because India became self-sufficient by 2005 with regard to response forces, medical equipment, assistance and funds. India became a self-sufficient country to manage its own disasters. All right. So Prime Minister Manmohan Singh laid down the norm that we will politely refuse the offer, will not take any assistance from governments. All right. However, NGOs and international organizations like UN, they will be allowed, but through local NGOs, not through government. Government will not take support from them. Government of India will not take support. It will not allow states as well. They will not take support from any foreign entity. Is that clear? Essentially, governments will not take the support, but government might allow NGOs and United Nations and organizations like Red Cross and other important organizations to work with local NGOs and carry out relief work to help victims of disaster in India. That is the policy we have with regard to foreign assistance. I'll summarize, I'll repeat this. The law is not prohibiting foreign assistance. It has left the matter to the center because it's a foreign policy decision. Center may accept, which means center can decide whether it can accept or not. States can't do it on their own. It's a foreign policy matter. Center has to decide. The established norm here is that the convention is that we will thank the countries giving the offer and politely refuse the offer coming from foreign governments because we don't want any obligation on India. We don't want any restrictions on our foreign policy. But if NGOs and UN and global organizations are giving support, maybe money or medicines or food, will not reject it outright. We will allow them to implement their relief work through local organizations, through local NGOs. They can contribute the funds to some NGO in India working with state government or with the disaster management authority. Government will not directly take the financial support. So basically, bottom line is that government of India and state governments cannot or will not accept any kind of foreign support. All right? Unless our capacity is completely overwhelmed, where we are not able to deal with the disaster itself, that is when we might accept foreign support. But till now, we have never faced such a situation. Any big disaster, we have handled it on our own because today we are a self-sufficient country. Is that clear? So please remember this because even this is a trending topic. It's been in news since few years. So kindly remember this. Any offer of assistance from UN, international agencies, etc., we may accept this, but they will ask them to work with some local NGOs and other institutions. Government will not take it directly. But if it's from foreign countries and governments, we will politely decline the offer. Is that clear? NGOs are allowed. They can operate. They can provide humanitarian assistance by working with concerned local institutions and government entities. But government itself will not directly take that financial support. So these are the key points I wanted to cover in disaster management. And now this brings us to the last point, the last part of my discussion. What efforts have we taken through our foreign policy, in our bilateral relations, in our multilateral engagement to build disaster management cooperation? This is the last point, and we'll end the class with this, and we'll look at the previous questions. See, first of all, as a signatory to Sendai framework, we have abided by the principles and the targets and adopted them into our policy and plan. And we work closely with friendly countries in our neighborhood and beyond and provide HADR assistance to affected countries. Today, India is a specialist in disaster management, thanks to the DM Act, thanks to NDRF, NDMA. We are sharing this expertise and these resources with other countries when they are suffering from disasters. This is technically called as HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. HADR assistance, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. On humanitarian grounds, we provide assistance to other countries when they are hit by disasters. For example, we launched Operation Maitri in 2015 when Nepal was hit by a devastating earthquake. NDRF and Indian Armed Forces, including Army, Navy, Air Force, were deployed in Nepal when it was devastated by the 2015 earthquake. It was codenamed Operation Maitri. Recently, we carried out Operation Dost in Turkey and Syria following the massive earthquake in Turkey and Syria. We gave assistance to Mozambique when it was hit by a massive cyclone last year. Mozambique is an East African country. Similarly, we give assistance to Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh. We have even helped Thailand and Indonesia when needed. So any country in the Indo-Pacific or beyond, we will reach out to them. We will help them in some way or the other. We'll give them funds as a grant, or maybe send medical supplies, send NDRF teams and doctors, or provide essential supplies. So some kind of support is given by India. We carried out Mission Sagar, which was done by the Indian Navy when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. I hope you guys remember this. Indian Navy went on a mission to multiple countries across Indian Ocean, supplying drugs, PPE kits, sanitizers, oxygen cylinders, etc. We provided this to several countries in the Indian Ocean region under Mission Sagar. This is an example of our HADR assistance we have given to other countries during disasters. There are many more, but I'm just giving you a broad idea. So Operation Maitri, Dost, and Mission Sagar, these are examples. So under Mission Sagar, Indian Navy supplied all the essential medical items needed to fight the pandemic to Sri Lanka, to Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, then Mozambique and Tanzania, and Vietnam, then Bangladesh, Myanmar. All of them were supported by India through Mission Sagar. Right? We also engaged in vaccine diplomacy. When vaccines came out, we supplied vaccines to several countries across the region, from Sri Lanka to Maldives to Seychelles, Mauritius, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. They were all supplied with COVID-19 vaccines from India. So these are some examples that you can give to highlight how India is helping other countries by providing HADR assistance. It's part of our foreign policy. All right? It's a part of India's soft power diplomacy. We are projecting India's influence and power and helping other countries in distress during their difficult times. We also use regional groupings and multilateral platforms to provide this assistance and improve such cooperation. Through groupings like BIMSTEC, we have conducted disaster management exercises, and there is a dedicated disaster management platform under BIMSTEC grouping. Under SAARC, there is a disaster management center that provides for support to the SAARC members. Under Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is a major grouping of Indian Ocean, India provides disaster management assistance, and we cooperate with other countries as well. Is that clear? We conduct many disaster management exercises as part of joint military exercises. The examples go on. Even at groupings like Quad, the quadrilateral, disaster management, HADR assistance is a priority. We work with Japan, Australia, and US. In fact, the Quad grouping was formed based on the 2004 tsunami experience. When 2004 tsunami hit Indian Ocean, for the first time, Indian Navy worked with the navies of Japan, Australia, and US to give assistance to many affected countries. That is when Shinzo Abe, the former PM of Japan, came up with the idea of bringing the four democracies together to form a grouping that finally led to the quadrilateral. These four countries have a military exercise called Malabar. Under Malabar exercise as well, disaster management operations is a priority. All right. So we are working bilaterally and also through regional groupings and multilateral institutions to share our expertise and assist other countries. So we have conducted many disaster management operations. We have conducted disaster management exercises. We also have discussions on this topic, and we share knowledge, experience, arrange funds, and help out the weaker countries. Even at the latest G20, India has pushed a discussion on disasters, and it has established a disaster working group through G20 as well. As we are holding the presidency, we are promoting discussions on disaster management through G20. Even through SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, even SCO focuses on disaster management. So through all such important groupings, we are contributing through multilateral organizations and regional groupings, and also through our own bilateral initiatives. Is that clear? So please remember this point. This could also come as a mains question. A 10-mark question on India's role in assisting other countries during disasters. What kind of HADR support have we given? What approach do we have in bilateral relations, regional groupings, and multilateral organizations? So bring out all these points. How we work with UN, how we work with countries like US and Japan and Australia through Quad, how we work through groupings like BIMSTEC, SARC, and IORA, how we bilaterally give assistance as well to friendly countries and any country for that matter. Right? This is purely done on humanitarian grounds, and that is India's soft power diplomacy. So this completes my elaborate, detailed discussion on disaster management. We have covered all the key topics. You don't have to read anything else. What I've discussed should be more than enough. Now, of course, your responsibility is to cover current affairs, then revise and practice. If you can do this, trust me, your preparation for disaster management is done. All right. Now, please bring up all your doubts and questions. I'll answer them for a few minutes. SMEs, please push all the good questions into dismiss section. Meanwhile, we'll look at some previous year's questions, PYQs. We'll take up maybe a couple of questions for discussion, and then I'll answer all your doubts. Now, look at this question from 2013. 2013 mains paper. How important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? As an administrator, what are the key areas you would focus in disaster management? It's actually a simple question. It's conceptual. So you have to explain what is vulnerability, what's risk assessment, why is it important in pre-disaster management. So you can bring out the DM cycle, show that in pre-disaster management, we focus on planning and preparedness. And to plan and prepare, you have to understand vulnerability, how vulnerable a region is towards a disaster, right? So vulnerability determines disaster risk, and explain through risk assessment, we figure out which regions have the highest risk, which regions are vulnerable. And through better planning and preparedness, we can reduce vulnerability and reduce the risk. If you can bring out that assessment and give that equation as well, where disaster risk is hazard multiplied with vulnerability and exposure, right? So depict that in the introduction and the first part of the body, and your answer is completed. Next question, the next part here is asking your opinion